Welcome. Have you ever felt baffled with how the hell we got to where our country is today, where the West is today, and you want to peek into the future? Well, today's show is about explaining where we are all at through understanding the last 60 years and understanding everyone's future. Now, everyone has stories about the absurd contradictions and government lies during Western responses to COVID. The lies, the fear, the low severity, in reality, are magnified, blown up by propaganda. Today, we have an expert who will make sense of it, Dr. David Martin. He's arguably the best qualified with experience and insights in medicine, healthcare, national governance, finance, research, discoveries, and patents, industry in general. We're going to learn about David and then provide him with a platform to share his knowledge. Now, I want to make it very clear. David is careful to remain objective. He avoids expressing an opinion on the global terror campaign. He has, though, shone a light on the published facts. He loves data, loves facts. He's not interested in ideology and absurdities. Importantly, he's an everyday citizen who's been doing what he does since 2001, the anthrax scare. So he's well versed in what we're going to be covering, all those topics. To help me as host is Dr. Philip Altman. He's an expert Australian pharmacologist, although he's got another Yankee accent. He's been a contract research organizer, one of the best in Australia. He's had involvement with Big Pharma for 40 years. So I'll let him explain what he does. He knows Big Pharma very well. Now, my office introduced Philip to COVID, not to COVID, but to the COVID response, finding him to assist one of Australia's most prominent doctors to register a COVID treatment protocol with the Therapeutic Goods Administration. What he then experienced opened his eyes. After 40 years with Big Pharma, it opened his eyes. And he has become one of Australia's and the world's most outspoken critics of the response to COVID. Another person, meticulous in his facts, doesn't state anything as an opinion, only facts. His knowledge will mean that he will ask relevant questions in our chat because I'm not versed in everything. And as a senator, I have to get across a lot of topics. So I need people with the expertise to help me. So he's going to pick up things that I miss, and he's also going to introduce things. We've worked on the agenda together. What we'll do on this podcast is acknowledge Dr. David Martin's congressional and parliamentary testimonies around the world and his many interviews and podcasts. We have the data now on COVID response. Now we seek compensation for those the government's response affected. Lockdowns, mandates, restrictions, jab injuries, people's livelihoods smashed, whole lives turned upside down, futures destroyed. Compensation for small businesses decimated, compensation for individuals, compensation for families. And for the children who developed debilitating mental health issues due to lockdowns, isolation, and missing school. This was a complete bastardization of humanity in Western civilization. We also need treatment for the thousands of people, the millions of people that the COVID shots have crippled. We need compensation for the injection injured and bereaved, including dear friends of mine. I'll just give you a little teaser. Moderna filed with the US Patents Office a modified nucleotide sequence in 2016, US patent 9587003, 3 years before any hint of a circulating pathogen. And I got that information from listening to Dr. Jessica Rose and Dr. Brett Weinstein, and David will comment more on it. We now know that work on COVID first emerged way back in 1965. Yes, you heard that correctly, 1965. And David will talk about that. Today, we're heading into very scary territory. Some people will run away. That's understandable. Others know there's something medically unwell with their child, with themselves, with their loved ones, with dear friends. And we'll continue to listen because this conversation will likely reveal the causes so that they can learn about the cures and the treatments for those who care. So I know it's a parent's nightmare to have maybe given authorization to inject their child with the COVID injections and realize that it could have hurt them seriously, maybe even killed them. So please watch it. I can understand your reluctance as parents maybe, but please watch it for your friends, your family members dying of rapid onset cancer, multiple cancers, or with heart problems, or even just a niggle. Dr. David Martin will address these and more. So welcome, David.
Malcolm, it's lovely to be here. And as many of you know, I have a deep affection for Australia and Australians, having been integrally part of the Australian community since the 1990s. And far more important, having a beautiful wife and daughter who are both Australians. And so Australia is home.
Well, we share that because I've got an American wife and American children, dual citizens. Of course, yours would be dual citizens. So let me get on to David's background, because I was going to ask him to tease this out, but it's quite an accomplished career. David Martin, I'll read this out from a bio that I found on the internet. Dr. David Martin is the founding CEO of MCAM Incorporated. MCAM is the international leader in intellectual property-based financial risk management. From auditing patent quality, so he knows about patents, auditing patent quality for governments and patent offices, to providing state-of-the-art actuarial risk management systems and solutions to the largest banks and insurance companies. MCAM has established a global standard in patent quality and commercial validity assessment and management. That's one of the many reasons I'm looking forward to today. He's a spokesperson for global intellectual property accountability and quality reform, and I've seen some articles about his work, and it's quite stunning. Dr. Martin has worked closely with the United States Congress, numerous trade and finance regulatory agencies in the United States, Europe, and Asia. So he understands the global picture, probably better than any other person. In advocating and deploying infrastructure to support growing reliance on property rights in business, proprietary rights in business transactions. MCAM has supported the modernization of intellectual property, tax, and accounting laws through its work with oversight agencies and policymakers. And you'll see this when he starts talking about some of the insights. So we've got someone who's involved in the medical industry, but who can go well beyond into law and finance. Dr. Martin has founded several for-profit and non-profit companies and organizations and serves on several boards. He was the founding CEO of Mosaic Technologies Incorporated, a company that developed and commercialized advanced computational linguistics technologies, dynamic data compression and encryption technologies, electrical field transmission technology, medical diagnostics, and stealth and echoic technology. He was a founding member of Japan's Institute for Interface Science and Technology. He founded and served as executive director of the Charlottesville Venture Group. He has served as a board member for the Research Institute for Small and Emerging Businesses in Washington, D.C., the Academy for Augmenting Grassroots Technological Innovations, India, the IST in Japan, of course, I just mentioned, the Charlottesville Regional Chamber of Commerce, Virginia, and the Charlottesville Industrial Development Agency. And that gives us an insight because, as you've seen, he's not 150 years of age. So he's packed it all in, and he's across so many topics. And so add to that list technology. And this is where it gets even more interesting. As former assistant professor at the University of Virginia's School of Medicine, where he was a professor, Dr. Martin founded the university's first wholly owned, for-profit research and development and technology transfer corporation. So he understands technology in the medical industry. He understands patents in the medical industry. He's across the whole picture. He's engaged in domestic and international technology transfer, clinical research, and financing. This company pioneered I'm getting out of breath just reading this. This company pioneered new techniques, innovation management that have become industry standards. In 1999, Dr. Martin was appointed by the governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia to serve on the Joint Commission on Technology and Science, and has served the General Assembly and Virginia's Center for Innovative Technology on numerous occasions. Dr. Martin's work with the Batten Institute at the Darden Graduate School of Business Administration. We went to Chicago, my wife and I, David. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Condolences.
I was going to get in first, but I thought, no, I won't. I knew that had happened. Administration at the University of Virginia and his related work at the Indian Institute for Management in Ahmedabad. India has brought unprecedented curricular focus to areas of intangible asset risk and management, finance, and accounting standards. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Martin has closely advised intellectual property-based finance and investment programs in India, China, Denmark, the European Union, the United Kingdom, South Africa, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the United States and the United Arab Emirates. Now, one country wasn't mentioned, that was Australia, but he's also helped there, which we'll find in a minute. Dr. Martin has publications in law, medicine, engineering, finance, and education. He's a Renaissance man. He maintains active research in the fields of linguistic genomics, fractal and financial and risk modeling, as well as continuing his over 15 years of research in cellular membrane ionic signaling. Wow, I'm exhausted, Philip.
Me too. Very impressive. Very impressive.
And we've got the man with us.
And then I have lunch.
And he's also got a sense of humor. Now, I've invited David to come on because he's addressed, what would you call them, inquiries in this country. And he's addressed inquiries on topics like defense and governance in this country, COVID in the European Union. So he's put everything on the public record. So I think I've covered that. David, can you tell us about your company, please? The advisory services, the scope of work, where you get involved, and you work globally. We've already established.
Yeah, right. And why don't we start by putting it in Australia? I, as many people know, I worked very heavily with the Australia Law Reform Commission in the early 2000s, and was frequently working on modernization of Australia's public policy with respect to innovation, both out of universities. I'm trying to support small business emergence in Australia. And then when I became, a resident down there, courtesy of Kim and Sienna's wonderful invitation to join their lives, I was delighted to move and had the opportunity to set up the Center for Applied Innovation at the Melbourne Polytechnic School in Melbourne. We were able to work very closely with the Australian government on trying to establish an innovation and broad spectrum technology development and small business development program there. And then also during the same time I was down there, I was appointed to be expert in residence for the state of Western Australia, which is, by the way, part of Australia. I found out that when I was there, the vast majority of Australians had less knowledge of WA than I did. I found that to be somewhat ironic, but I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time, not only in Perth and kind of the more traditionally industrial areas, but I also had the great fortune of working with a lot of the, what we would call Aboriginal or community of persistence groups out in the bush, deep in the inner part of WA, and was able to work very closely with a bunch of the traditional knowledge keepers there on how to build their own kind of awareness around where modern innovation was going and how to make sure they protected the Aboriginal and Indigenous rights of their knowledge. So I had a program down there called the Heritable Innovation Trust, which we've run all across the Pacific and now around the world, and worked very closely with the Australians. Specifically, Malcolm, though, to get to our answer of so what is it that I do? Let's start with just a very big, broad brush statement, which is enshrined in the Constitution of the United States and enshrined in the Commonwealth law of all the Commonwealth countries is only one true economic right, and that is the right to creativity. Whether it manifests in the form of copyrights or patents or anything else, the only right universally applied across all of those structures, all the way back to, if we go to the 18th century, what we'll find is that the only right that we preserve for every human is the right to ingenuity and creativity. Tragically, most countries don't have a robust mechanism for the individual outside of affiliations with large corporations or large financial institutions. Most people don't have a way to bring that individual right into their own public benefit. And so for now, over 30 years, that has been the mission of what was Mosaic Technologies and MCAM. Our goal is to make sure that every person, regardless of where they are, regardless of what their background is, has the ability to access the destiny that is informed by their creativity and make sure that we remove any barriers from that happening. And that is what we've done successfully, starting thousands of companies all over the world, starting enormous numbers of research programs, and then ultimately commercial programs. And I am deeply dedicated, as you know, from my work on CNBC, which was very public until I started speaking out about this recent topic. We were the voice of innovation to the point where the United States Federal Reserve used our indexes as a measure of the global economy. So to this day, the innovation indexes of the world are ours. And we actually measure the direct contributions of innovation in share markets and in banking and in every other situation. So, the goal is to make sure that we remind people that certainly for the last 300 years, we all have the right explicitly, and we all have the pathway implicitly to use our creativity and innovation to advance society. And that is what I care about. That is what I'm passionate about. That's what I built an entire career around. And I am grateful that I continue to do that every day.
And that's what I love about you, because in some of my research, and we first started connecting about September, I think. Yes. And I said, just let me have a few weeks and we'll get together after I've done my research. Well, as a senator, a few weeks turns into a few months. So we finally connected, and I'm so glad we did. But one of the things I realized in doing my research on you, David, well, I'll explain it. A few years ago, we had a very eminent scientist here called Dr. Bob Carter, and he was running around the country, as was I, as a volunteer, addressing the climate scam, the climate fraud. And he said to me one day, he just looked across and he said, this must be the biggest scam ever. And I said, David, Bob, it's not even close. He said, What do you mean? And he said, well, I would put it at number 3. Number 2 is the money scam, the ability to print money out of thin air that's given to a few. If you or I did it, David, we'd be in jail as counterfeiters. Correct. But the banks can do it. And then he said, well, what's number 1? And I said, the anti-human scam.
Yeah.
And that's where they're demonizing people. We can talk more about that later. But I'm very, very pro-human. And what we have to do is rekindle that. And I saw that in your work. You actually stated you're here to serve humanity, which is the same thing I'm here to do.
Yeah, exactly.
So let me just go on a little bit more about MCAM before we start talking go back to your early childhood. MCAM was a contractor with the United States Treasury uncovering white-collar crime, and with the USA Department of Commerce on global financial reform, the Internal Revenue Service, the taxation collectors in America, where you testified or reported on patent donations, and in so doing tangled with the National Institute of Health, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, Department of Defense itself, the Department of Energy, the NASA's National Aeronautics and Space Administration. You've shown that the IRS has no way to do its job. So what you've done is you've put many fingers on the bureaucracies in America. And that's the root cause of many of these problems. Sure, we've got some greedy bastards leading corporations, leading bureaucracies, but they're free to run the roost because of the bureaucracy being so slack. This is typical of the United States bureaucracy. I've lived and worked in America. It's typical of Australian bureaucracy, David. So you've got a good sense of what's going on around Western society.
Well, and I think one of the things that we find common is somewhere, as I said, the universal right of benefiting from innovation and creativity, which is a beautiful thing, and it's enshrined in all of our foundational laws. One of the tragedies is that we've allowed elected government officials and the bureaucracies that they enable, and it's a very kind of insidious parasitic relationship between the two. But we've allowed them to deprive humans of their right granted capacity to have visibility, accountability, and even playing field. And so that's once again why it's such a passion of mine to say that the only currency we all have is the currency of how we apply our innovation and our creativity. And that is something that we all have implicitly and tragically, and I did a lot of work, as you know, with the whole question of TAFE reform in Australia. I did a lot of work on going back to the early 1900s declarations of what the role of education was in Australia. And when you go and look at it, you realize that the establishment of the national education policies in Australia were basically caste systems akin to India, where it was, there were certain people authorized to think, and there were other people authorized to labor. And you just sit there going, well, hold on a minute. Every human being has a capacity to flourish. But here we have policies and we have procedures then reified by bureaucracies that make access to education something that you have to be born into the right family. Then you have to go to the right, prep school, and you have to go to the right thing. And I was amazed to see that as early or as late as 2016, when I moved over there to live, I was just shocked to see how much of the legacy of that turn of the century, the last century thought process was still absolutely alive and well in Australia. And if nothing else, I tried what I could to help emancipate the rights and the abilities of people to practice innovation, regardless of the merit of birth or the merit of socioeconomic status or the merit of whatever social framework they were born into.
Yeah, yes, and it's really quite thrilling to have conversations with people. For example, I've run coal mines, I've managed coal mines, and I go underground, and a miner will say to me, "I'm just a coal miner," and I said, "Don't you ever say that again."
Yeah.
That was one of the few times I'd get angry, because I'd say, "You're in a profession that's requiring enormous skill, enormous courage, and also you're turning the lights on for people around the country. You're causing cars to be built around the world, and we all have that ability to contribute." So
that's exactly right.
It's really important that we liberate people, and that comes with liberating their mind. So that's another reason for having you on. Could you go back to tell us where you were born?
Well, ironically, I'm one of the few people who can say this following sentence. I was born in Fargo, North Dakota, and a lot of people always chuckle when they hear that, because the only thing most people know about Fargo, North Dakota is a very somber, nearly depressing movie bearing the same name. My father, who is an astronomer and astrophysicist and a passionate person of faith, decided to move from the cold climate of Fargo, North Dakota, shortly after I was born, to San Diego, where he was at San Diego State University, and so he was both doing research as well as teaching at San Diego State, and then we moved up to the area right outside Los Angeles, where I spent most of my childhood. I often say that I'm the byproduct of a father who loved the expanse of the universe, telescopes and rocket launches and all that kind of stuff. So we had that input. And my mother, who was a classically trained linguist, who is passionate about translating the Bible from Greek and from traditional languages. And so, I'm the convergence, not surprisingly, got into both science and linguistics, because I'm, kind of marinated in the soup of both of those. And, one of the great attributes of my parents was that they had an enormous passion for trying to do everything you can to make a positive impact on the world. I very much remember Christmas times in my childhood, where in lieu of Christmas presents, there was a decision made to provide funds for humanitarian outreach. I never forget the floods in Bangladesh in the early 70s, where our Christmas was postponed to just an orange so that we could send money to buy emergency food relief in Bangladesh. I mean, these are things that my parents instilled in us about saying every person has the capacity to make a difference and make a good one. And so I grew up in that environment. And as I said, both my parents were exceptionally religious, dogmatically so in certain extents. And so, that was interesting, because my worldview from a very early age was that there's a big world. There's a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different backgrounds. And while that put us at odds to a certain degree, I have to say that the core value, which is a core value that says that humans are wonderful, amazing, phenomenal, capable creations, and the emancipation of the human spirit is a pursuit worthy of absolutely every breath. There's no question that from my standpoint was very much of an imprint that I live with to this day.
That explains so much, because Maria Montessori, who, in my opinion, was the greatest source of observations and knowledge about and philosophy about human development and human behavior, said the critical years for the formation of both character and intellect are birth to 6.
Yeah.
So now I can see where you get your big picture view from, where you have your faith in humanity. So you've just explained the next question. Significant influences during David's formative years. You could see the big picture, and when we look at the universe, we think we're just struck with awe, and then we realize we're of the universe, not part of the universe. We're of the universe.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's beautiful.
Well, so let me just give you one very short anecdote of my father, which actually is quite explanatory when we come to my curiosity. My dad was, as I said, he was an astronomer. Astrophysics was kind of his passion and his profession. But what was beautiful is one night we were all sleeping in sleeping bags on the floor of an observatory in Southern California. And at early morning hours, probably between 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, my dad was absolutely ecstatic, and was so ecstatic that his enthusiasm woke us all up, because he had discovered this unbelievably amazing thing that nobody had seen in astrophysics to that point, which was this very interesting star formation that, according to his data, was emitting sodium, which is a very unusual find. So he was quite enthusiastic about this, and he had just discovered it at 3 o'clock in the morning. And there's an old janitor who was pushing a broom in the observatory while my dad was working. And without missing a beat, my dad's just, thinking he probably just, I don't know, won the Nobel Prize in astrophysics or whatever. This old janitor pushing the broom goes, "Congratulations, Mr. Martin, you discovered the city of Los Angeles." Now, that statement was funny, because apparently this had been not the first time sodium had been discovered. But what had happened was, in the 1970s, the city of Los Angeles would switch off mercury vapor lights at a certain time. In an energy-saving move, they'd switch over to sodium vapor. And sodium vapor would penetrate the higher altitude elevation. So truly, my dad had just watched the switch from mercury to sodium in the city of Los Angeles. But the sodium vapor was so prevalent that he was pretty sure he had discovered a sodium mission from the land far, far away. But the point of this, and this is the part that I love about the story, because it's quite instructive. Sometimes what you see needs to be informed by the janitor pushing the broom. Sometimes you need to have the insight where you might not say, well, he's not a PhD astronomer, he's not a PhD astrophysicist, he doesn't know what he's doing. But you know what? He's been around long enough that he can smell truth and he can smell BS. And the good thing about it is he wasn't confrontational. He's still just pushing his broom. And even in how he addressed my father, it was in a loving, condescending way. It wasn't "you're an idiot, this is what happens with LA." It was just the wisdom of a guy who's been pushing the broom through many almost Nobel Prizes. He had a view, and it was informed by experience. And that view, informed by experience, gave him the opportunity for such an innocent and beautiful clarification. Which
and
then
done so well.
And it was done so beautifully that there was no offense taken. And that's why in the conversations that we're having now, I encourage people just to set aside everything that's belief or judgment. Just set it aside and just look at the facts. And the facts in this case were the city of Los Angeles turned on sodium vapor lights. And my dad thought he had discovered a star. That's cool. And there's nothing wrong with either one of them. But facts informed by experience are extremely powerful.
Yes. So can you tell us about your early work experience and interest? And then we'll talk about your academic qualifications, because they're stunning. So early work experience?
Well, the first business I did was set up my own landscaping company in southeastern Pennsylvania, because I wanted to actually start having money. I did not come from wealth and privilege, and I decided that it was a good idea to do that. So I started that. It was very successful. Ultimately sold that business. And when I went to college, I worked through college.
So you had the business to earn money to go to college.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah, we were not riding on any coattails. We were sewing our own coats. So it was all good. And that worked out very well. I was extremely grateful for the opportunity to have the entrepreneurial spirit very early on. Hard work, a lot of sweaty days, a lot of hot summers in southeastern Pennsylvania. And we were living on a small farm. So I often say that by hand milking cows and working in old order Mennonite and Amish machine shops, you learn everything about how to fix anything or create anything because you don't have the standard access to, kind of the modern conveniences. So I grew up, I often say I didn't have the average teenage life because I was hand milking cows early morning and early afternoon every day. And, when you're getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to milk cows and you're going home and milking cows at, 4:30 or 5 in the afternoon, you don't have time to get into trouble.
So you worked with the Amish, did you?
Well, my family, as far back as you go, is Mennonite and Old Order Mennonite. So horse and buggy, and I've got a couple great grandfathers ago that was the bishop that led the split in the church to make sure that people stayed appropriately conservative. So yeah, it's a very fascinating space. But yeah, that's where I lived. So we had neighbors that were Old Order Mennonites, neighbors that were Amish. Our farm was kind of split in the middle. So
for those who don't know, my wife, by the way, David, was born and raised in southwestern Pennsylvania.
Oh, right. Okay.
Around Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And before getting to meet her, I actually worked in eight states. I visited all 50 American states. So when I was in Kentucky, I think it was Kentucky, working there, I visited the Amish family. They're wonderful people. They're very, very basic, and they've got strong values. And they don't impinge them. They don't push them on other people.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's so. But the ethic of hard work is not even questioned. You don't even know there's a version of life other than that, which is good, because then what happened was I actually had the opportunity, as I think I've mentioned to you in a previous communication, in the mid-1980s when I was at college at Goshen College in Indiana. I had the opportunity to go to Central America during the Nicaraguan War. I worked on an emergency clinic on the border of Costa Rica and Nicaragua up in Guanacaste province. During that period of time, I also had the opportunity to understand a number of what the United States government activities down there were. A lot of the work that I uncovered was helpful in understanding what became publicly known as the Iran-Contra scandal, because it turns out that where I was stationed and where Iran-Contra was happening were within about 7 miles of each other. So I got to see United States government corruption kind of right in front of your face. I was literally, on the day of the opening of the Iran-Contra hearings, I was sitting in a Jeep on the border of Nicaragua, listening as the congressional testimony was going on Voice of America. And remember, I'm an American sitting in a Jeep on the border of Nicaragua and Costa Rica when people are testifying that we have no Americans on the border of Nicaragua and Costa Rica. And I'm sitting there listening in this existential time warp. I was literally sitting in my Jeep with the Voice of America broadcast going on, being told that I wasn't there, which is interesting because I felt like I was very much there. But the more I unpack that experience, and that is relevant, by the way, in the COVID situation, because many of the actors who ultimately became actors in funding the campaign that we are going to be talking about were people who were very much involved in running guns and running drugs in Central America during the 1980s.
Yes, and it's fascinating for me. I went to America when I was 24, and as I said, I've been to all 50 of your states. I've worked and lived there and studied there for about 5 years. I'm married to an American. Look, when I got there, David, I thought America was the best country on earth. The ideals, the founding fathers, just stunning. Nothing like that had ever happened in humanity. Yeah. And America could almost do no harm. But then when I started researching climate fraud and getting into it, I started to realize that the Americans have lost their country. The American people are absolutely wonderful, but the American government, I'm not talking about Trump, I'm talking about the bureaucracy, the people, the globalists that control the American government or have taken it over. They're insidious, they're evil.
Well, and I think here's the problem. The problem is that Tocqueville described us as the house on the hill and the great American experiment and all this kind of stuff, the great humanitarian experiment in his work in the 1700s. But I'll tell you that the challenge is that, and by the way, this is a cautionary tone for everybody, not just for America. But when complacency takes the role of the accountability for democracy, and I want to be really precise on this, the accountability for democracy, once we allow complacency to set in, we're the lucky country, we're the lucky people, we're the, house on the hill, you pick your metaphor. When you do that, when you allow complacency to enter into your perspective, then all of a sudden what you do is you create a vacuum of accountability into which enormous amounts of nefarious actors can move. And if you look at everyone, go back to Vietnam, go back to Korea, ever since the Second World War, what you'll see is that we started telling ourselves the greatest story, right? So we went from being aspirationally great to now we're going to tell ourselves we are great. We'll just recite it so many times that we actually think we believe it. But the problem is, by not looking carefully at what was going on, and we can go back and we can look at Kennedy, we can look at Lincoln, we can look at Johnson, we can look at all of those transitional leaders. And what we see is their awareness that the country was slipping away. And tragically, what we saw happen is that special interest, and specifically the ability to, in private, in covert operations, corrupt the public message and the public mandate, became ubiquitous with what we called leadership. And what we really need is we need to get back to a place where the moral compass is not calibrated on the nefarious funding sources that are behind whoever might be in power. We need to have public accountability. We have to have public transparency. And most of all, we have to have citizen level accountability. We are responsible for the country we have. We are, in fact, responsible for the leaders that we have. And if we don't like them, our job is not to sit there complaining about it. Our job is to say, hey, how about we examine our role, our complacency, our participation in that system, and I don't know, God forbid, take some accountability.
Well, I agree with you. What the message that I've been spreading around the country wherever I've gone as a result of COVID mismanagement, it's not a result of COVID, it's a result of COVID mismanagement, the stealth, right, the fraud, is democracy is not a passive form of government. It soon lapses into tyranny. Democracy must be an active form of government where citizens are actively engaged, not just at voting every 3 or 4 years, but far more. We'll come back to that. Yeah. So you're going to college now?
Yeah, so I went to college. I had a very serious accident the third year of my undergraduate years. I was a long jumper. I unfortunately, at the first outdoor track meet of the season, in 1987, landed wrong. My legs at the knees, both of them ripped apart. So my feet were kind of sticking up next to my tail end. Lost the use of both of my legs in an extremely horrific accident, which put me in a wheelchair, which meant that I had to change my major in school. I was at the time planning on going to law school. And it turns out that back then buildings weren't accessible. So I finished my undergraduate degree by any classroom I could wheel into on ground floor. That was my that was my undergraduate blessing and curse. I could only go where wheelchairs could go, which meant I had a fairly, let's just say, a tossed salad of classes for my last year and a half of college. Then I went to Ball State University.
What did you graduate with? What degree?
It was biology, psychology, and sports medicine.
So again, the universe intervened in the right way to shape David Martin.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like you said in your intro, my intro appears to be very broad in its scope, and it's in part because I was in a wheelchair. So go put that one into the life plan, programming that a lot of people look for. I happen to have the very, very good fortune of going to the Human Performance Laboratory at Ball State University, where I got my master's in physiology. I was very fortunate while there to be a part of the, at that point in time, nobody even knew about it, the Boehringer-Ingelheim first clinical trials on cholesterol tests. That was a reflectance photometry technology that was just coming into being. And it turned out that we happened to hit a medical device exactly at the right time, because the Boehringer-Ingelheim Reflectron, which was the first reflectance photometry device to measure blood cholesterol, that clinical trial happened to coincide with the publication of the Framingham Heart Study, which was the first very large population study on cholesterol. And so accidentally, I happened to be in the room when the biggest clinical trial on one of the biggest medical breakthroughs in terms of diagnostics happened. It was a huge success. And at exactly the same time, Quaker Oats contracted our lab to set up an examination on a product that they thought might have some popularity and might have some legs, Senator Roberts, and that was a little product called Gatorade. I don't know if you've heard about it,
Yep.
but those two events converged while I was there. And here's what happened. You get to see, and I have often said this is just, this convergence of life events that you happen to just be part of and witness. I got to see both in the medical and in now this whole category of called sports drinks. I got to see what happens when science and industry collide. And the big takeaway from that experience was watching how much the collision of those two interests can both advance things beautifully and at exactly the same time, they can be hijacked so quickly.
Yep.
And so I did get my master's, but I also got kind of a PhD in the time in the corruption of science for commercial gain. And there's a whole bunch of stories we won't talk about that one. But the good news is I got to see what happens when science becomes that which is only shaped by the purse that's paying for it. And that was a pretty interesting learning. But during the same time, we did a bunch of other technologies, which ultimately led to my transition to the University of Virginia, where I was asked to come while I was finishing my doctoral degree. I joined the faculty of radiology and orthopedic surgery. I had an appointment at the time with the engineering school. And so I was very helpful in establishing what became the biomedical engineering program at the University of Virginia. At the time, it was fledgling. And by the time I left, we had several $100 million of research money coming into that. So I got it.
So how old were you? How old were you then, David?
So that was 1992 when I went to the University of Virginia. That would have been, I was, I had just turned 30. No, sorry. I just turned, what is that? 1992. So I had just gone through my 25th year.
Okay. So you've packed a lot in already.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I'm jumping over 1983, my first congressional testimony.
Tell us about that. You were only 16.
Yep. I was asked to come to testify in the Congress in 1983 on the then implementation of what was the Carter-Reagan transfer that led to the establishment of the reinstitution of selective service, which in the United States is our version of the draft. And I testified in Congress first in 1983 with the Senate Armed Services Committee members and several other people. So, I'd already done a couple things by the time I got to my doctoral program.
You were born in 1967.
Yep.
Okay. And you've packed a lot of experience in already. What happened when you left the University of Virginia?
It was an interesting experience. I was doing a huge amount, and Philip will be able to help clarify this. But back then, contract research organizations were almost all pharmaceutical. There were a bunch of CROs all over the world for pharmaceuticals. At the time, there was no contract research organization anywhere for medical devices. And so at the University of Virginia, I set up a company. It was officially set up under the Department of Radiology, not surprisingly, because we had big ticket items being approved back then. That was MRI's early years. That was some of the contrast enhanced CAT scan technologies. That was some of the nuclear medicine stuff very early on in nuclear medicine when we were looking at gamma emitters. We were looking at iodine. We were looking at a bunch of different things that ultimately became what we now know as nuclear medicine. So cardiothoracic nuclear medicine, that kind of stuff. A lot of breast cancer work back then with DuPont, Miraluma, and other things. And so at the University of Virginia, I set up the first in the history of the University of Virginia and in the history of the United States, the first for-profit contract research organization for medical devices in America. And we liaised directly with the FDA on clinical trials for medical devices. And so I got to kind of cover the entire gamut. If it was a medical device, it was surgical equipment. It was diagnostic equipment. It was, we did as much as even going down to the first combined drug device submissions for hyperpolarized helium and xenon. These kinds of projects that were very esoteric, but it was the first time the FDA really had a CRO for medical devices. And that was my company. I set it up. It was a company called IdeaMed. And I had founded that. We were very successful in getting a number of contract research programs. Once again, a little history. Back then, universities in America predominantly had two lines of funding. Most of them come through the National Science Foundation or National Institute of Health, so public funding. And in the case of most universities, the only contract research they had that was big ticket contract research was with pharmaceutical companies. So you either had NIH, NSF, or those kinds of things, or you had drug money. Those were the two kind of primary funding sources.
I love the way you said that, drug money.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm pretty blunt about it. The medical device concept of being now a much broader aperture of funding sources was something that really hadn't been examined very, very closely, and largely was the domain of research at institutions of the businesses themselves. So somebody might have a research lab as part of a company, but having a university affiliated medical device CRO had not been done yet. And so that was where my contribution in that business became not only very successful, but so successful that in 1996, I was called into my chairman's office at the Department of Radiology, and he informed me that I was no longer needed to teach in classrooms because I needed to focus all my time and effort on going out and getting money, more grants, more projects, all that kind of stuff. And I looked at him and I said, well, the reason why I'm at the university is because I love to teach. I absolutely love to teach. I always love to teach. And he said, well, nobody would be dumb enough to do that if they could just do what you can do, which is go out and raise money. And I said, well, I'm going to tell you how dumb I am. And I went back to my office, no kidding, right after walking out of his office. I packed my office up and left. Within about 2 months, all of the IdeaMed clients who were UVA clients decided to follow me, and I set up Mosaic Technologies, and really the rest is history. I mean, from 1996 on, the success of merging industry experience and scientific expertise was so desperately needed. And typically what you found is people who were excellent at one or the other. And we have in the United States, we have a term for it. We call it the valley of death, between bench science and early applied science and actual commercial application. And it's called the valley of death for a good reason, because nobody gets across it. There's tons of really great innovation, tons of really good research. And by the way, in Australia, you know exactly what this is. CSIRO in Australia has had tons of really great innovations and tons of really great insights. But bridging from the great innovation and insight to industry has always been a challenge, and it's been a huge challenge. Enormous amounts of public money is spent on research that never sees the light of day. And so by being the bridging mechanism to bring those worlds together, I had a business that was truly unstoppable, and it hasn't stopped since.
Well, that's interesting, especially your comments around the CSIRO, because you've opened up a door that I'd love to go into later. The CSIRO is now tarnished in its reputation, especially on climate fraud.
Yeah, exactly.
And on energy. It's completely tarnished because it relies. But what the door you opened up for us is that Big Pharma controls some of the institutes.
Yes.
Now, and Big Pharma controls some of the academia.
That's correct.
And so you merge the two, and you get the institutes controlling the academics, and then you have research, so-called research, going in a certain direction, and that's the only place you can get money. And to keep that money going, you need to publish results that confirm Big Pharma's on the right track when it's not.
That is entirely the case. If you go back and look at the amount of genuine innovation, and so what we're going to do is we're going to put contrast around patents and scientific publications, which is something I've studied, as you know, for many, many years. What I find fascinating is that we can look, and I did this exercise, by the way, in the early 2000s for the Small Business Small Emerging Business Institute for the SBA, Small Business Administration in the United States. We took SBIR grants. That's the Small Business Innovation Research grants, SBIR grants from across every industry. And we contrasted them to patent filings. So simple exercise. Just take the grant applications and take patent filings. And what you found is that almost everything that was funded research in the United States, as much as 90% in some industry sector, was researchers getting funding from the federal government to ask a question that had already been answered in a patent and had proven itself to fail commercially. But because these two organizations don't look at each other, all this nonsense over here called funded research is chasing its tail going, look, I've got this idea. And at no point did they actually examine, hey, has anybody ever tried this before? Because the echo chamber that happens in academia is, well, we're on to something new. Well, maybe. But I'll give you a very simple example. We use Bacillus thuringiensis as a genetically modified vector to genetically modified seed crops. Now, BT, and you see BT corn, BT cotton, BT this, BT that, Monsanto, Pioneer, Cargill, all these companies use Bacillus thuringiensis as a vector, a genetic vector to transfer certain genetically modified organisms. Now, in the early 1900s, are you ready for this? The Japanese already found out that BT toxin causes leaky gut. It's the reason why we decided to use it as a pesticide in the early 1900s. Lo and behold, Malcolm, fast forward to genetically modified crops, and we're putting BT toxin into everything. And we wonder why so many people have GI problems.
Yep.
Now, the published science, no kidding, the published science by 1905 in Japan had established that the BT toxin was going to create this problem. But because, are you ready for this? It was written in the early 1900s in Japanese. Clearly, it couldn't be found. It's ludicrous.
Yep.
We knew we were creating a problem for the U.S. and the world's food supply. We knew we were creating gastrointestinal problems. We knew it was going to happen. And the data was very absolutely clear by 1905. But you fast forward to genetically modified crops, and suddenly everybody wonders why there's so many food allergies, why there's so many, celiac disease, why there's so many leaky gut problems, why do we have such a problem with human gut biome right now? I don't know. Because we didn't read a paper from the early 1900s because it was written in Japanese. That's the problem too, because what we're doing is we're not looking at the information that's available because we delude ourselves into believing that because we had an idea, it must be the first time that idea came out. Not even remotely true. And if you look at the difference between scientific publications, which are industry funded, let's get really clear. You can't find a journal that doesn't somewhere find its funding source trailing all the way back up to some industry. So science is funded and approved through peer review, which only allows to advance the things that are aligned with the funded mechanism. God help you if you find out something that doesn't fall into line with the funded mechanism. Because if you do, it doesn't get published. It's not peer reviewed. You don't get promoted for tenure. And lo and behold, the whole system falls apart. So the structure of how we do science, and by the way, the number of people who lecture me on, but you're not embracing science. I don't think, to be perfectly honest with you, since the Cold Spring Harbor Labs eugenics program in 1913, I don't think science as a construct has been done entirely independent of its funding mandates. I don't think it's been done. And certainly by 1953, if you go from 1953 forward, there is not a chance, not a single chance, that you can show me a piece of science that doesn't at least have the plaque of a funding source driving the merits of the science.
Yes. You raised 2 points there, David, and we'll move on to something else soon. But the definition of a scientist is not someone with a BSc, MSc, PhD after their name. The definition of a scientist is anyone who follows the scientific method, the objectivity, exactly. And that's it. That's it, full stop. You also pointed out that the government has captured science, and that big pharma has captured agencies.
Yep.
And for the money to flow to academics to do research, they must comply with the message, the narrative. So we don't have science these days. So let's come down to excuse me, your connections with Australia and the Australian government. You've been invited to take part in the Law Reform Commission and inquiries, etc. Can you tell us something about your association with Australia so that Australians can get the sense that, hang on, this bugger, he talks with a Yankee accent, but he's all right. He knows our country.
And I have had Vegemite on appropriately buttered toast, so I do know that. And I do know that Vegemite is the byproduct of brewer's yeast scandal. So I got all that, and I do have wonderful family members who give me all kinds of Aussieisms that now have slipped into my linguistic profile. So I can legitimately hang with people in Australia in certain instances, but I'll never aspire to Kim's ability to master the Australian language. No, so listen, at the insistence of the Australian Law Reform Commission, there was a big problem that Australia had because Australian innovation policy was highly problematic in the late 90s and early 2000s when the rest of the world was trying to figure out how to do technology transfer and commercialization. Australia was actually being publicly embarrassed by its mythology around what it called applied science. Famously, CSIRO, unfortunately for themselves, decided to grossly misrepresent their involvement in the innovation about Wi-Fi, one of the things that CSIRO to this day still says it invented, and laughably fails to even look at the patent record to see that their own patent was invalidated by virtue of the fact that Wi-Fi had already been around. But let's not set facts in the way of the myth. CSIRO was kind of running. There were a number of innovations that were legitimate innovations that were coming out of Australia, particularly in some of the universities in Queensland, where there's some really cool stuff going on in water quality, water purification technologies, some interesting pharma stuff coming out of some of the schools in both New South Wales as well as over in Victoria. So there were some really interesting things happening, but there was no infrastructure. The patent system in Australia was Neolithic compared to what was going on in the rest of the world. And so part of this was to try to get Australian innovation to be essentially market tested and market ready for the global economy. And that's how I got down there. I was invited to be part of those hearings and then ultimately written into a couple of really big books that I think are nothing more than doorstops in some legal library somewhere. They're really big books, but that's what happened. As I spent time in Australia, however, I began to be involved in a lot of other programs. One of the things was working on some of the Queensland reform around, and this is a total tangent we won't go into on this call, but I was very involved in looking at mining rights, particularly across the Pacific and parts of Africa. And so I got very involved, as Senator Roberts, you would definitely know, the history of Queensland and its association with places like Papua New Guinea and Bougainville and all kinds of things. So I got involved with a number of things that were very much outside the scope of my original charter, just because I was in the room when people started picking my brain about stuff I was doing in other parts of the world. And as a result of that, I got extremely involved in a number of initiatives on legal reform, as well as kind of land rights, application of technology and land rights issues. And so basically from 2003 onwards, I made probably 3 or 4 trips a year down to Australia and came to know and love New South Wales, loved the Queensland area, ran all the way up to Cairns, which was my launching off point for all the islands. And then when the Fijian coup happened, I kind of was a backdoor for a number of Australian interests into understanding what was going on in Fiji. And I was working then with the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. And as a result of that, I had a great relationship with a number of folks in Australia who were interested in maintaining informal dialogue while the formal dialogue was not allowed to happen because of the coup. And that expanded. And then in 2014, I was doing a big seminar down in New South Wales, just north of Bondi, and I was asked to go speak on a Australian and New Zealand innovators cruise going to Antarctica. And lo and behold, one of the people on that cruise happened to be a beautiful blonde-haired crazy woman named Kim. And then I got sucked in. The whole time I kept flying back. And I often say, with a lot of affection, the great news is, Kim was the object I saw first, the shiny object on the boat, and we had a lovely interaction. She was amazing. But a month later, I had the opportunity to meet her daughter, and if I was on the fence about falling in love, meeting her daughter was one of the best things in my life. So,
thank you.
The incentive to make Australia part of home was very high then.
Okay, thank you for sharing that personal insight. Could you tell us something about your interactions with Australia, former Prime Minister Morrison, and Defence? You were invited to be part of an inquiry, as I understand it, and you unfortunately told the truth, and people didn't like that. Is that right?
Well, I won't take too much time, but in short,
I just want to paint the picture that you know what the hell you're talking about when you're talking about Australian government.
Yeah, it gets pretty bad. Scott Morrison and obviously Minister Hunt and I, we have a couple things where I don't think I'll ever be on anybody's Christmas list. And I think we can go back. Malcolm Turnbull probably is not going to put me on the short list for the Order of Australia either. But I was working with a number of organizations down there. One of the things when I was at the Center of Applied Innovation, I had pointed out was that the fraud and government corruption associated with what was happening in Melbourne at the time, the area around Geelong was transitioning away from the automotive companies that were there. And there was obviously the fight between Melbourne and Adelaide and other places about who was going to get the submarine contract, the DCNS contract for the sub construction that Australia wanted to do, which, by the way, in its infinite wisdom, was trying to put sub bases on the southern part of the continent, which makes perfect sense to be effective in the global theater. I still to this day have been mystified by the brilliance of logisticians who would say that if you want to have a rapid response submarine program, the best thing to do is put it as far from the global theater as physically possible, unless we have that much anticipated land invasion of penguins from Antarctica, which I know is part of the strategic national defense priorities of Australia. But because the penguins, they march, we know that. There was a movie about it. And because of that, we need to have our water defense forces right there. But I was looking at the corruption of the DCNS contract in Adelaide, and I was looking at the corruption of the land vehicles contract, which is the most corrupt thing I've seen in Australia in terms of military procurement. Because the theory was we'd take all the automotive infrastructure that we had in Melbourne and we'd throw it into building land vehicles. There were going to be some extension of German and European defense vehicles. Tiny little problem is that the armor systems that were on these vehicles had been countermeasured by Eastern Europeans and Russians with fin-stabilized rocket-propelled grenades that we had actually uncovered several years earlier with a land invasion problem in Gaza, where we actually found the patents and ultimately found the deployment of rocket-propelled grenades that could go right through what was called armor. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the term armor, just because I know I'm different with an American accent than I probably should have said, because I should drop the R. It's probably more ama or something along those lines. But it's tragic in that the experience of that particular contract was that I was invited to go to the barracks in Melbourne, the Victoria Barracks in Melbourne. And there was a gentleman by the name of Brigadier General Major McGloon, I believe his name was. I don't know how many different titles he had, but I know it was a Brigadier General. And I know it was McGloon at the other end of it. And I pointed out to him that the land vehicle procurement that was happening was actually going to buy armored vehicles that had already been countermeasured, such that if Australia put its men and women in uniform in those vehicles, RPGs on the theater of battle could go right through the armor and could kill Australian servicemen and women. Now, I don't know about how you guys feel about that, But if Australia is building something called an armored personnel vehicle, and then we put our men and women in our service in a vehicle where they're told that they have armor to protect them, when we know that the specification of that armor is already countermeasured, it's already compromised. So what we were doing was we were going to buy and build vehicles that were mobile coffins for Australian men and women. And then we were going to do the flag draped coffin nonsense when they come back going, oh, look, they died serving their country. No, they didn't. They died because somebody was making a decision informed by their retirement aspirations to go work for the contractor. There was the contractor that got the bid.
I love you. Love the clarity and the bluntness. You know, Australians have
I made the mistake of saying it out loud at the barracks. And I was told that that was something that I should, quote, watch out for because people like me don't last. That was what I was told at the barracks. Now, the irony of this is I was with some PricewaterhouseCoopers defense partners not long after that, and they were telling me about some dust-up that had happened at the Victoria Barracks. And they said they couldn't get any details on it because it happened in a skiff. It was in a classified briefing. And I looked at them and I said, for the briefing to be classified, the door had to be closed. And there was a pin drop silence. And I did the same thing, by the way, with the DCNS, with a number of the other parts of the defense apparatus. And I know Scott Morrison got those reports. And I know that the Dan Andrews in Queensland, in Victoria got those reports. I know that because they were delivered by people who took them straight to them. And here's the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is facts aren't welcome when there's already graft and corruption, where the commitment to the graft and corruption is already made. And I happen not to shut up. And apparently I was anti-Australian for that. Now, conveniently, because they were very upset with, obviously, my behavior, while I was living in Victoria, and while I was quite literally, physically living right outside Melbourne, my visa was canceled. Not just my visa. The whole class of my visa was canceled. So when I tried to apply to get a visa to stay with my wife and my daughter, I was actually told that I couldn't get it because I couldn't unhave the visa I had that was canceled. So the office that would have processed canceling that visa was shut down. So I could not apply for another visa because I was stuck in this limbo state. So when I flew home, seriously, in the late fall of 2018, I flew back to Melbourne to go back home to be with Kim and Sienna. And I got into the airport in Melbourne and they said, you can't come in. I said, well, why? They said, well, your visa's canceled. I said, yeah, I know. I got a tourist visa. And so I have my tourist visa to allow me to come in. They said, well, you can't have two visas. I said, well, I don't. The one I had, which is the actual one that I had professionally, that visa was canceled. Well, they tried to call whoever it was, wherever it was in Canberra, I guess it was. And they said, well, yeah, that class of visa is canceled. I said, well, great. So what are you going to do about it? Well, the people who were associated with issuing that visa and canceling that visa don't work in that office anymore. So the great news is I've got a zombie visa that I can't use. And I'm trying to get in to go home. Remember, I'm just trying to go to my house in Melbourne. And I'm sitting there in the Melbourne airport fighting over the bureaucracy that was put in motion to make sure I was silenced in Australia. So
right, it goes to enormous lengths to silence people. I just want to point out to people that here in Australia, what you're saying has been vindicated because Australians have an amazing reputation for innovation and ingenuity. We're pretty innovative people, but everything that we have bought in the way of defense equipment, David, as you know, we have managed to fine tune and screw up.
That's exactly
everything.
Right.
And as you say, it puts people in the armed forces at risk. And that shows a complete lack of care in the bureaucracy in this country for men and women's lives.
Well, and listen, let's be perfectly blunt. I've been in combat theaters all over the world. You make decisions in a combat theater based on your best available information. And if you are a 25-year-old, 26-year-old mechanical division operator, and you believe that the vehicle you have has armor, you're going to engage the theater very differently than if you're in a Jeep that has a rag top. And the problem is we are having zero problem at all telling these young men and women, hey, you've got an armored vehicle. We don't have any problem with this. Just like we can tell somebody that they're in a sub that allegedly has all kinds of great stealth technologies, except for the fact that the DCNS sub procurement that Australia was doing had never looked at the cavitation signatures, which is the bubbles that come off of the propellers, to actually deal with the silencing effect. And lo and behold, Australia would have these wonderful submarines, which are some of the easiest to detect. So now you're not just a surface land vehicle problem. Now you're under the sea, easily detected. And now you have 40 or 50 people at a minimum, as much as 100 and 150 people if it's fully loaded, that are now in a giant sinking weight that is already countermeasured. And the Australian government is buying that from France. For what reason? What's the strategic reason? Nobody could ever answer that question. And I was at so many conferences and so many meetings. And my point is that Australia, because there is a fundamental commitment to saying that because we have to play the game, the geopolitical game, we have to play the game that says we have to keep European contractors happy, we have to keep American contractors happy, we have to keep all this stuff happy. And by the way, in the pharma space, I can guarantee you that the reason why the Pfizer contracts and the Moderna contracts are hidden from the public record in Australia is because if you actually found out what was written in those in terms of the liability shields that were granted to the companies without any territorial review, it's actually in violation, ironically, of federal law in Australia. But you can't know that because nobody will actually divulge the contents of those contracts in their totality. Everything that you get is redacted, torn apart, barely disclosed. And this is something that cannot be allowed to happen because the fact is, if the country is a handmaid of corporations, then the Australian people lose.
Well, what you're saying about the COVID contracts is correct, but it's actually worse than what you're saying, David.
Yeah.
The Liberal Party Liberal Party government signed those contracts with Pfizer, Moderna, etc., but they refused to allow us to see those contracts.
Yep.
And yet we're paying for it. We, the taxpayer, not we, the senator, we, the taxpayers, are paying for that.
Yep.
That's our right to see those contracts.
Yep.
Excuse me. Then, and the Labor Party, when it was in opposition, voted with us to get the contracts. The government defeated us. When the Labor Party came into government, some of the Liberals came together with us and put a motion in the Senate to require the Labor government to show the contracts, and they refused.
Yep.
So it's secret. Excuse me. Let's transition now from what you've been doing. You've established that you're completely competent in all these aspects. You're involved in the mouthpiece media as well. So we're bringing the mouthpiece media, the globalist media, the Big Brother media, the captured media. And can you describe what happened with the EpiPen scandal? And tell people who are watching what the EpiPen, EPIPN is and what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Epinephrine is something that's very repeatedly used for people who have anaphylaxis, which is just the extreme allergic reactions to things. And so bee stings, certain food allergies, certain shellfish allergies, etc. Epinephrine has been used for a very long time to deal with anaphylaxis. It's nothing new. But there are certain modes of delivery and certain compositions of epinephrine that have been used as a proprietary formulation in pharmaceutical industry. What happened was a company came along and said, what we're going to do is we're going to, by virtue of the patent on not only the way we formulate epinephrine, but also on its delivery, which is a pen, injectable pens, we're going to now take what should be a generic drug. Let's be very clear. Epinephrine's been known and used for a very long time. We're going to take what is fundamentally a generic drug, and because of the way we're going to deliver it and because of the way we're going to formulate it, we're going to charge, are you ready for this? $40,000 a dose. Now, I don't know how many people have just spare $40,000 laying around. I know I don't have an extra $40,000, and if I had to choose, if my child's out playing soccer, they happen to have a bee sting allergy, I'm not going to have a $40,000, extra little sachet in my car that has the $40,000 EpiPen to keep my kid alive. That's nonsense. And so I pointed out the fact that the patents in this case were actually illicitly gained they were entirely illegitimately granted, and they needed to be validated or invalidated. And not surprisingly, at the time, as most people can go if they look at my history, I was a contributor to Bloomberg. I was a contributor to CNBC. I was actually running the CNBC IQ 100 index at the time. So I was frequently on these major media outlets, and I said, this scandal has to stop, because this is nothing more than pure graft and corruption. There's nothing about this that is legitimate. Well, I was told that I was being anti-industry when I first brought it up. So I left New Jersey and I went home and I wrote an op-ed about the EpiPen situation. And by the way, anybody who wants to look at it, all they have to do is put my name in an EpiPen. Oh, there you go. You've got it right there.
It's real.
The real EpiPen scandal. So in 2016, it was one of those things where I just refused. I refused to shut up. So I left the editorial meeting. I went home. I wrote the op-ed, and lo and behold, the next day, CNBC picked up the op-ed, and we busted the whole scandal. We got the price of the drug and the price of delivery back down to where it should be. And this was a wonderful experiment, because at exactly the same time, and this is the part of the story most people don't know. I've also written about this. But the oldest emergency use authorization we have going on in America is not COVID. The oldest one we have still ongoing is the opioid crisis.
Yeah.
And that was one, as many people who follow my work know, the Sackler family that ran Purdue Pharma. The Sackler family had filed patents on a non-addictive form of opioids. These are the compounds in a form that you can't get addicted to. Okay. They had filed patents on those so that no one could produce them. They never intended to produce them. So they filed patents on the non-addictive forms and then only produced the addictive forms.
Jeez.
I sat, no kidding, for 18 months in an editorial meeting, CNBC, to pay attention to that. Tiny little problem. Guess what industry pays for NBC's advertising?
Yep. Big Pharma, 75% probably.
And so you're sitting there with literally, I mean, we have an emergency use authorization because we have tens of thousands of people dying every year, and then hundreds of thousands, a lot of estimates would put the numbers in millions, of people who are permanently disabled by opioid use. And we're doing what? We are actually watching them march to their death. Well, the solution is sitting in a patent in the hands of the people who are actually facilitating the merchant of death position. And I thought that was a story that should be told. Man, did I find out, when you decide to take on big pharma, and I mean really big pharma, the battlefield changes entirely. And ironically, my fight on opioids crescendoed when a tiny little other thing happened in the world, which was when I tried to get people to pay attention to the September 18th, 2019 publication from the World Health Organization, where they said that a lethal respiratory pathogen would be released so that by September 2020, the world would accept a universal influenza and coronavirus vaccine. You want to know how quickly you can shut down all your friends in mainstream media? Try to point that out. Try to point out that the World Health Organization on September 18th, 2019, before there's any patient having COVID, try to point out that they said that there's an accidental or intentional deliberate release of a lethal respiratory pathogen. That's premeditation, that's murder, it's racketeering, it's domestic and international terrorism under our Section 802 of our Patriot Act. Every single sentence in that particular document on page 8, World at Risk, World Health Organization, World at Risk, every single sentence in that is a violation of at least 2 to 3 felony laws in the United States. In many parts of the world, they are
and
much
Australia.
Yeah. And not a single person wanted to hear that.
Well, that's why I've deliberately gone through what I find to be a fascinating life story from you first, because I wanted to establish with the viewers that you know what the hell you're talking about, because some of the things you're going to be saying from here on will be so stunning, but you've got the credibility. So Big Pharma has ingrained itself in academia and controls what's published. So
That's
people who want
exactly
to publish, who want to make money as a so-called research scientist, must kowtow to Big Pharma. The institutes, the agencies, the bureaucracies receive funding from Big Pharma, and they are under control of Big Pharma. Advertising, the media, is under the control of Big Pharma. 75%, I believe, and we'll talk more about that later, but I believe 75% of media advertising in America is funded by Big Pharma. So they control what is deemed to be science. They control what the bureaucracy approves and does not approve. They control the propaganda machine that's in big media these days. So Big Pharma controls a lot of what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And the tragedy is in the capturing of agencies. What happens is, I mean, and remember, the counterpart to the FDA in the UK, and I want people to hear this very precisely. The counterpart to the FDA in the UK was funded by the Wellcome Drug Company. That's like asking, I don't know, organized crime to fund the police department.
And who's connected with Wellcome, David? You know that.
That's Burroughs Wellcome Trust. Jeremy Farr, the architect, along with Anthony Fauci, along with the Gates Foundation. Jeremy Farr, who sat on the committee board that wrote the death sentence for millions of people when they wrote what they did on September 18th, 2019. He signed the document. His signature is on the document. Jeremy Farr's signature. Dr. Elias from the Gates Foundation, his signature is on the document. Anthony Fauci's signature is on the document. That there's going to be a specific terror campaign for the purpose of getting the world by September 2020. Listen to the dates. The milestones of success is by September 2020, the world's going to accept a universal vaccine template. One day later, September 19th, 2019, President Trump signs the executive order for DNA-linked vaccination production. One day after the World Health Organization said that we're going to release a lethal respiratory pathogen for the purpose of advancing a vaccine program, one day later we have an executive order because obviously, no, not obviously, that's entirely tongue-in-cheek, we didn't have a problem.
Yep.
But we have an executive order mandating what ultimately became Operation Warp Speed, signed September 19th, 2019. Listen, the point is that the facts are already established. These are public records. These are not my opinions. None of these things are my opinions. These are matters of public record. But the fact of the matter is you have somebody like Jeremy Farr at the Wellcome Trust, the derivative of the very famous Burroughs Wellcome pharmaceutical juggernaut in the Commonwealth, across the Commonwealth. They're UK, but they're across the Commonwealth. You look at these individuals and you look at the fact that this was premeditated. Every act was premeditated. Going back to their statement in 2015, that to get the public to accept a need for a medical countermeasure, defined term, need for a medical countermeasure called a pan-coronavirus vaccine. And now I'm quoting, we need the media to create hype. We need to use the hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of the process. Is any of that sentence even close to sounding like public health?
Not at all. It's all about control and wealth transfer.
But the worst part about it is to convince the public of the need for a thing. Oh, let's take a step and just pump the brake on that one. We don't need a medical countermeasure for a thing that we haven't weaponized. But, oh, that's right, we had already weaponized COV from Wuhan in 2016. In February of 2016, we had already published that WIV1, the Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1, COV, was, quote, poised for human emergence. That is published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences 2016. Now, I'm going to ask you a simple question. Do you think that a bat read that article somewhere in the Guangdong province of China and then flew 1,000 miles to get to a wet market in Wuhan to go, oh, the humans want me. No, that's ludicrous. Wuhan Institute of Virology virus 1, their words, not mine. Supplied by, ready for this? The Wuhan Institute of Virology. All you have to read to the bottom of the article, all you have to do, see Dr. Zhengli Shi, the contributor of the sequence that was weaponized at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, published in 2016, poised for human emergence. Is it any wonder that the image on the cover of the World Health Organization's publication in September of 2019, the image on the cover is coronavirus?
Premeditated. So let's follow up on that, because you've established now your credentials for doing this. Let's consider, first of all, people's feelings around the COVID hysteria, David, before coming back into the details, because this is where we're headed. The fears, the insanities, the contradictions, the costs, the crippling of people, the killing of people. Yeah. It's homicide.
Yes, it is.
And so not just one or two, it's thousands of cases, perhaps millions of cases. But these things now start to make more sense because, people could not understand the contradictions before.
Yeah.
The understandable fear of people delving into COVID injections for fear of what parents may have done to their children and to themselves. Right. But they didn't do it to their children.
No.
It was the propaganda that forced them to do it to their children.
That's exactly right. Well,
yet knowing the facts.
Yeah, and let's take a step back because this is an old playbook, and I want to remind everybody of the old version of this playbook. We have to remember that the Tuskegee experiment, which is very famous in U.S. history, coexists with, that's right, the discovery of penicillin. So we have syphilis, allegedly a problem with syphilis, and lo and behold, we're using the syphilis outbreak to justify the global acceptance of penicillin. We have in 1984 the emergence of what 2 years later we would then call HIV and AIDS. And we use the AIDS scare to justify the passage of what was then called the National Vaccine Injury Act, which is the Childhood Vaccine Injury Act in the United States, which was for what purpose? It was to protect vaccine manufacturers from ever having liability. Because, oh my gosh, if they had responsibility for the products that they produced and they had liability for the products they produced, that wouldn't be economically viable. So if we remove all their liability.
Could you just go back over that, please, David? David?
Yeah. Yep.
David, could you just go back over that, please? Because it became a bit fuzzy with the connection just then. That's a significant point that we must get through.
Yeah, no worries. Can you hear me now? Are you're hearing me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect.
Yep.
So in 1984, we have this advent of HIV/AIDS. 2 years later, 1986, we have Ronald Reagan signing the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which actually was a way to make sure that we shifted liability from vaccine manufacturers so that they could, quote, do it without losing money, right? So the whole idea was we wanted to get rid of liability from vaccine manufacturers. So we passed that act, and we have a global outbreak, allegedly, of AIDS, which is the motivating impulse to say, oh my gosh, we need more vaccines. Lo and behold, the architect of that, ready for his name? Anthony Fauci. Now, listen carefully, because what happens next is even worse. We decide in 1990 and 1991, we decide that we're going to play around with this thing about expanding the aperture of what we call a vaccination. And in the Gulf War, we start injecting men and women, servicemen and women. We start injecting them with experimental, quote, vaccines. Remember, these are not vaccines even in the classic definition. Because remember, the classic definition of a vaccine is something that's supposed to disrupt infection and transmission. Because the entirety of the viral model is about a thing that comes into the cell, then it replicates, creates an inflammation response, it replicates, and then it goes out, and that's how viruses allegedly move around, right? So let's stop for a second. The whole purpose of a vaccine is to take some of the information, in some cases almost all of the information, of what we describe as the pathogen, expose the body to it so an immune response can be built up. That's the theory. Mm-hmm. And by the way, we've done all kinds of things with that. Introduce a protein have the inflammation response, have the immune response, and then we move forward. But here comes the kicker. Starting in 1990 and 1991, we started injecting men and women in the services first with experimental agents that had nothing to do with infection or transmission control. The most egregious first example of that was the anthrax injections. And to this day, despite congressional inquiries in the United States to what was called Gulf War syndrome, you remember hearing about that in the news? To this day, we know we have evidence that there were an enormous amount of catastrophic immune activities that ultimately led to the injury and death of thousands of servicemen and women. And no one is willing to point the finger at what everybody got. So we try to make up, it's toxic burn pits, it's this, it's that, the other thing. Nobody's even willing to consider that maybe what we shot in their arms before they were deployed. And then we manufacture, as you know, in 2001, we manufacture the first domestic terror campaign in the United States to then change the law again, now to move this vaccine liability shield, not from the childhood injury vaccines, into the realm of adults. And so, September 2001, we have the United States Department of Defense distribute, leak, whatever you want to call it. I actually did the investigation on this, so I have the details of what happened. But they distribute anthrax through the mail in the end of September 2001.
The military did that.
Yep. Suddenly, the world starts yelling about the need for, are you ready for this? Medical countermeasures. And lo and behold, under Anthony Fauci's direct supervision, President Bush signs into law the PrEP Act, the Pandemic Preparedness Act, right? And the PrEP Act now extends the liability shield, not just from the childhood vaccine schedule to the adult vaccine schedule. Here's the kicker, though, and this is something that everyone needs to understand. The last time the law, and by that I literally mean the law, defined what a vaccine was, because we're going to get into this, because CDC and FDA and everybody else started throwing around terms like vaccine, when what they were and should have been doing is calling it an experimental gene therapy, which is what it is and was. But they started using the term vaccine to hide into the legal statutory protections about vaccine manufacturers. But here's the bad news for everybody. In April of 2020, so this is in the alleged pandemic period, after the emergency use authorization was announced, so this is now, let's remember, this is April of 2020. The emergency was declared in January, at the end of January, January 30th, backdated 31, backdated 29th. That's the declaration of the emergency. In April of 2020, nearly 3 months to the date afterwards, both Moderna and BioNTech, in their securities filings, said that mRNA injections are, and I'm quoting, experimental gene therapies. Now, that's their published data. I'm not saying it. That's their words. In April, they're experimental gene therapies. And now we have the CEOs on record saying that they chose the term vaccine because clearly the public wouldn't accept gene therapies. They have admitted to the deception where they took an agent they knew was a thing. And by the way, it was classified as such by the FDA, by the CDC, by everybody. It was classified as experimental gene therapy. But by using the term vaccine, they both hooked the public into falling for it. And then worse than that, they got themselves hidden under this nonsensical emergency use authorization, which could not have been done if it had been, in fact, said to be what it actually is. It's an experimental gene therapy.
Yep.
And as much as people don't like me saying that, they have to go back and read the fact that in 2000, when the Darwinian Chemical Systems Grant, which is the grant from the National Science Foundation, which 10 years later became Moderna. And you heard me say that correctly.
Yes.
2000. The Darwinian Chemical Systems Grant from the National Science Foundation 10 years later became the company Moderna. The reason it became a company was because they had succeeded in getting RNA to write into the genome. So when I say it was gene therapy, I'm not saying that Dave Martin. I'm saying they said it. They started the company because they had succeeded in doing what they then lied to the public about. Because how many times did they tell you, oh, mRNA is safe. It won't write into the genome. It won't do these things. And here's the tiny problem. By the time they made that statement, Malcolm, they had 20 years of data proving that that statement was false.
Yep.
20 years.
And what you've just shown now is big pharma controls academia, controls the institutes, the government bureaucracy, the agencies, controls the media, and it controls government. It literally causes government to put in place legislation. So that led to, and we'll come back to the details on this, but that led to the inhumanity, the denial of basic medical ethics and human rights on the pretense that it was an emergency, the restrictions, the lies, the fraud, the lack of care. So, and this didn't just happen in America. It didn't just happen in Australia. It was almost global, except for the Africans who dealt with the World Health Organization and told them to go to hell, and parts of the Indian subcontinent. But many countries around the world, this same phenomenon happened. So it's not just an American phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon.
No, controlled by two primary agencies. And I want to be really clear on this. While we say the World Health Organization as a moniker, we have to understand that that organization functionally has become, as it has always been, the marketing front for a pharmaceutical complex that includes, in the case of the World Health Organization, the Wellcome Trust, which we're going to come back to over and over again because their fingerprints are all over this. The Wellcome Trust, the Gates Foundation. If you look at Gavi's behavior, which is one of the largest advances of this kind of nonsensical redefinition of what a vaccine is, Gavi, which is the Gates Foundation's front, if you go back and you look at what these organizations actually are, and I've pointed out repeatedly that the World Health Organization is the surviving interest committee on opium trade. So when I talk about them as drug dealers, that's not a metaphor to me. They rebranded their name when they became the World Health Organization, but the exact same organization used to be the Standing Committee on Opium Trade. For those of you not familiar with that, that's drug dealing. And the fact that they domiciled in Switzerland and got extraterritorial protections because they were in Switzerland, so they couldn't be liable for their criminal activities, is written into their charter. You're not even allowed to investigate their crimes under the charter of the World Health Organization and its derived powers from the United Nations Charter. How insane is that? We have an organization that quite literally wrote into its charter that it can commit crimes, and it can do so, and it's precluded from even being investigated. You can't charge anybody. You can't even investigate them, which is the reason why it's so important for the public to understand that I'm not opposed to global health as a concept. I think it's a beautiful idea that countries come together and collaborate. I think it's a great idea, but you cannot allow a chartered drug dealing organization to be judge, jury, and executioner on the human race. And that's exactly what their charter does. Once again, not my opinion. Read the charter.
Beautifully put. So let's come into we've talked about the pain that the people are suffering and the feelings they're going through. Let's talk about the hope. Let's connect briefly with people's universal needs. A lot of people need compensation. They need their lives restored. And compensation means restoring or paying damages for an inability to restore back to the previous condition. Before you took that shot, before you had those lockdowns, what was your business doing? So prior to compensation comes the realization, the care, because we want the bureaucrats, as you know, David, and Philip Altman has really got direct personal experience in this country. The bureaucrats are just giving everyone the big middle finger. Yeah. They are saying, to hell with you. There's nothing. You're just telling the lies. We need the bureaucrats to face up and tell the truth, because only then can we get treatment for the people who are crippled by some of the ramifications of the COVID mismanagement. So we need, it starts with experts bringing the truth, understanding, and accountability. So that's our big need. to get compensation for what the government has caused, plus the needs for truth and trust, which is fundamental for governance, fundamental for medicine, basic and universal human rights, informed consent, primacy and independence of our relationship with our physicians, justice, fairness, basic freedoms. I wrote these down so we wouldn't take long about them. Basic freedoms previously taken for granted: freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of creativity and ingenuity, as you point out, initiative, I call it, freedom of exchange, freedom of movement. So that's the basic things we're trying to do on this podcast.
Yeah. So this is a great place, I think, to bring Philip directly into the conversation, because if we think about what the conditions precedent are for what you just described, we have to understand, and maybe because I always do this in technical jargon, so I'd love to have Philip step in and put it into language that would be something other than my voice. One of the things that's a problem is that because we know that the first infectious replication defective modification of this version of what's called coronavirus was patented at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 2002. So Ralph Barrick, the architect of what I refer to under his terminology as biowarfare enabling technology by 2005, the DARPA program that he started, that project was specifically about an infectious replication defective clone modeled off of coronavirus. Now, could you say that slowly to say what you mean by it? Yeah. That's why I'm gonna invite Philip to come in and help unpack that for people. But if you don't know the ingredient of what is making people sick or ill, you don't know what the ingredient is, then you don't know how to deal with, is this a short problem? Is this a long problem? Is this a lifetime problem? Is this potentially generational problem? We don't know the duration because we don't study what the thing was. So let's just be really clear. When you patent what's called an infectious replication defective clone, here comes the kicker. What you're doing is you're saying you want something to be more capable of getting into the cell, more capable of harming a person. But replication defective means you don't want it to then propagate outside of that body. So replication defective means I want you to get the effect in my body. That's the infectious piece. But replication defective means I don't want that thing to go out of circulation and get into the general population, which, by the way, is the reason why SARS 1.0 in 2002 going into 2003 didn't affect that many people. Mm-hmm. Total count was less than 800 people totally affected.
Because it couldn't replicate. Because
it can't replicate. And maybe Philip can step in and help people unpack the consequence. If you don't know what the thing is that you're using as this harmful agent, then it's very difficult to get into a conversation about how do we help people injured, dead, potentially disabled in this generation and future generations. And I think Philip could speak to that because I've seen some of his work, and I think it's important that we bring that in. If we can.
You frozen, Philip?
No.
I'm good.
I'm good. So basically, in the very beginning, we were lied to about really everything. I mean, not just a few things. I now have a list of, I think I'm up to something like 64 lies that our bureaucrats have told us. There's been nothing but lies. The biggest lie was that this was a vaccine, as David has referred to. They had to change the definition of a vaccine in the US after this whole thing had erupted. And people just don't understand what went on. They also, and this is an incredible thing. This is one of the most incredible things that I've learned about in this journey, is that in my 40 years of dealing with the Australian Therapeutic Goods Administration, and I dealt with them on many files. I worked for most of the big pharma companies in Australia. I had my own CRO, contract research organization, had doctors and nurses and pharmacists and statisticians and scientists and so forth, is that from the top down in the government, they said that these injections were, quote, safe, unquote. Now, I was absolutely appalled when they said that, because I knew in all my years of working within Big Pharma and then consulting for Big Pharma and providing sign off on advertisements by companies on behalf of the medical department of that company, that you cannot imply that something is safe. And I saw that and I thought, my God, they've actually said it's safe in an unqualified way.
Yep.
What they did, if you look very closely, there is something called the Therapeutic Goods Advertising Code, which is the instrument in Australia which controls what you can and cannot say about a therapeutic. And it specifically said you cannot claim something is safe, yet they were doing it.
Yeah.
How did they do that? Well, how they did that was and this was pointed out to me by a lawyer. I was involved in it in helping to write an expert report on mandatory vaccination. And I said I couldn't understand how they could do this. And he said, "Oh, Phil, it's easy. They just changed the wording of the Therapeutic Goods Advertising Code to exempt COVID vaccines." This was done by Scarrett. It's in writing. You can actually go and have a look at it. It was done in mid-2021, and it specifically said you cannot claim any therapeutic is safe and effective except if it's a COVID vaccine. This was part of the fraud and the deception that was done in the very beginning.
Well,
now,
and Philip, just to drive that point home, the cool thing is just about the exact same time, adverse event in the US and in Europe, just to drive this point home, adverse event was changed in 2018 to only include adverse events that were, quote, known and published in the literature. So you literally could not have an adverse event, because since there was no published literature, technically you could lie in plain sight. You could say, no, there's no adverse events, because the definition was changed in 2018 to say that an adverse event had to be already known and published in the literature.
Unbelievable. That is completely unbelievable.
And Big Pharma controls the published material.
Yeah.
Sure,
so all I have to do is not publish it, and it can't exist.
Sorry, Philip, I cut you off. But
no, I just wanted to make sure we got all of this. This was all premeditation for deception.
Yeah, and of course, as David said, these COVID so-called vaccines conformed precisely to the definition of gene therapy.
Yeah.
They had to change the definition of vaccines. This is how you can play with words. And it's caused such incredible damage. There was a senior executive, I think I recall from Bayer, but David might correct me, who said publicly at one stage, if we were honest and actually said these COVID vaccines were gene therapy, no one would take them.
Yeah. Yep.
that sort of disappeared in the mists of time. But he was honest, and he said that. And I think that people everywhere, if you were told that these things were experimental gene therapies, and that is the definition, roll up your arm, would you take it? Very few people would have done it.
Nobody would have.
So
Yeah.
the game was fixed in the very beginning, and there was fraud in the original clinical trials. I work with people who work with Naomi Wolf in the U.S. and so forth, who have gone through the data, David, and they have pulled out the data that Pfizer tried to hide for 75 years.
Yep.
And before Pfizer got their emergency use authorization from the US FDA, they knew that there were more deaths, more cardiovascular deaths in the vaccine group than the placebo group.
Yeah.
They knew it. Now, my business as a CRO working for companies, when you're doing a clinical trial on a new drug that hasn't been approved and you get a death, you have 24 hours to report that to the authorities. Well, in some cases, Pfizer didn't report this for weeks. And they waited until the approval, the emergency use authorization, was given by the US FDA.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not a lawyer.
They waited to report some deaths until
the US FDA.
After it was approved. That's correct.
They
I didn't know that
tell.
bit.
Now, I could go on and on, but to me, to my simple mind, to my simple understanding of what the word fraud means, I think this is fraud.
Yeah.
And if there's fraud, I guess the question is to ask of David, if these secret contracts have been agreed to and fraud has been committed in terms of disclosing information that led the governments to agree to these contracts, how can they still be valid?
Yeah, so excellent question. And Philip, this is the white hot core of where I was looking forward for us to go, because in the United States, we have a whole set of fraud, and particularly medical fraud, deceptive commercial practices, all kinds of stuff. You have in Australia and across the Commonwealth, you have a very robust set of laws around deceptive practices when it comes to commercial products and when it comes to medical products. So the good news is we have that in a bucket. In the Commonwealth, we have something that in the United States we don't have. The Commonwealth law is very robust around what's called fraudulent inducement, which is when you coerce someone into the fraud. So it's not just fraud, but you're coercing somebody to participate in the fraud, which is in fact what this entire campaign was, by their own admission, in 2014 and 15, when they said that they were doing it for the sake of using media to hype to get the public to accept a thing. So they've admitted to the fraud. So I'm going to unpack fraud in two different buckets. One for the United States and part of the world, and then the Commonwealth law that's very specific to fraudulent inducement. The important part of the fraud piece of this conversation is that under the emergency use authorization mechanism that's part of the PrEP Act in 2005, under that legal statute, fraud pierces the veil of the liability shield, meaning that if you were guilty of committing fraud in the promulgation of the emergency, then none of the liability protections exist. That's universal. So what I just said applies in Australia like it does in the United States. The additional kicker, which is the reason why I'm so passionate about Australia waking up to this, or for that matter, any Commonwealth country I'd love the UK to wake up to it. I'd love Canada to wake up to it. I'd love any Commonwealth country to wake up to it. Is under the Commonwealth law, you also have a thing called fraudulent inducement. And this is one step further, where the remedy, Philip, as you just pointed out, the remedy is not only do they not have a liability shield, so this can't be protected under some notion of a public health emergency. It's much deeper than that, because under fraudulent inducement, the fraud committing party has a requirement to restore the damaged party to its pre-aggrieved state. Now listen carefully what I said, pre-aggrieved. So what you have to do is not just pay compensation, right? I can't get away with just here's a couple of to cover your medical expenses. I have to restore you to your pre-damaged condition. Now this, back to Senator Roberts' opening remarks. What does that mean? I need small businesses to get all of the damage of loss of business back.
Yep.
How many restaurants shut down because of lockdown measures? How many small businesses failed because they lost their clientele? How many people were injured with employees that couldn't come to work? How many medical centers across the world were impaired because they had staffing shortages, nursing shortages, people who couldn't show up, orderlies to clean the place up? You know, if we look at the Commonwealth law, this is so much more powerful than just fraud in the United States. Fraud in the United States gives us the pierce of the liability shield, which is extremely helpful. But fraud in the Commonwealth would give us the ability to economically impact all of the perpetrators. And by that, I mean not just Pfizer and Moderna, or BioNTech, Pfizer and Moderna, not just them, but it would actually allow us to go after the marketing firms that put together all of the fraud campaigns, which became nightly news. It would go after the broadcasters who were the ones that were distributing what they knew to be false with no verification. This goes after so many other characters, and the economic recovery, if argued correctly in the Commonwealth, would have a geopolitical impact where the Commonwealth countries could effect a change that would be monumental and catastrophic to the criminal conspiracy that got us into this mess. And
Thank
so
you.
I am so passionate about, and by the way, this is the Australian heart that's beating in me right now, because the U.S. heart gets me, organized crime. But the Commonwealth law gives us a much more robust approach to say everybody who was damaged as a result of this fraud. And this goes to the bus driver who was kicked out of the bus. This goes to the ambulance driver who didn't get the shot and lost his job. This goes to every single person who is aggrieved.
Thank you for making that
case gets us the ability to do this. And the smoking gun for the shots is singular. By 2018, we knew that the inclusion of pseudouridine, which was an ingredient that was put in the shots to allegedly help stabilize the shots, by 2018, we knew pseudouridine was a direct contributor to the proliferation of cancers and the downregulation of the body's response to keep cancer under control. That was published in all the literature. There's no one who can argue in science that the inclusion of pseudouridine wasn't anything other than a willful act of premeditated harm and ultimately a premeditated murder. We didn't have the term turbo cancer in 2019. We didn't have those kind of nonsensical terms. We didn't have 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds who have myocarditis who, for the rest of time, will not have normal heart performance. And we didn't have those things. Go back and look. Published literature on pseudouridine and published literature on the lipid nanoparticle, which was the carrying particle that brought the injection into the body. Those two things were known and published to be lethal and harmful in 2018. And the reason this is so technically important is most of these cloak and dagger activities that were taken to change like definitions of vaccine and change definitions of safe and effective and change definitions of what safe even means. Those acts that I just described predate the changing of the terminology. So if people do this correctly and show that the fraudulent inducement was premeditated in 2015, in 2016, all of the pieces we've just described were fully redefined by 2018. So 2 years before the alleged pandemic is unleashed, we have the prep for all of that nonsense already established. What does that do? That allows us to go after the entire fraudulent inducement, Commonwealth law recovery standards, and we actually have a case that ultimately would have a financial ripple that would go around the world.
Right. So can we just go back? And by the way, people, I want to thank Dr. Philip Altman for being here because he's suffering with a virus at the moment. But thank you so much, Philip, for taking this time out because we know it's going to be a lengthy podcast. Could we just go through one point from David before getting through a checklist of facts and then getting onto the origins of COVID? Negative replication. Does that mean that the virus has lost the inability to replicate transmission is nil?
Well, yeah, replication defective is important to point out because as much as they wanted to scare the population into how dangerous the pandemic was, all of the hypothetical numbers that were thrown out about how deadly this thing was, we never even got close to any of those numbers. The actual replication effect was negligible. And so despite their best efforts, and this goes back to the nonsense that came out of, the work that was done in the UK, which was a data model that was used to convince us that we were all going to die. Tiny little problem with the data is it wasn't data. It was
Is that Ferguson?
Yeah, it was Neil Ferguson's data, but the Ferguson data was, are you ready for this? Simulated from a video game of contagion.
I'm not surprised.
We weren't going to die.
No. So let's go through a quick checklist.
Yeah.
And if you see something really important, go for it. But I'd like to just go through this checklist and then get on to your specialty, one of your specialties, David, and that is the origins of COVID and the development over since 65. We were told that COVID was lethal. Yet the chief medical officer admitted to me in answer to a question in Senate estimates hearings 12 months after COVID arrived in this country that the virus severity was low to moderate. And if you then take away the people who are immune compromised, elderly, etc., it means for the average person, the typical everyday Aussie and the American, it had very low severity. And in fact, I asked him to put his response, and he gave it to me in writing and in a graph, in terms of not only the absolute numbers for transmissibility and severity, but also the relative numbers compared with past severe flus. And there were past severe flus that were more severe than COVID. So we did not have...
2018 was much more deadly in influenza than 2020 was with COVID.
We did not have a severe threat at all.
No.
Next thing, the health experts told us that COVID was lethal because of the spike protein. Yet in November 2024, just a few months ago, the Therapeutic Goods Administration told me that the spike protein is not a pathogen. What's going on?
Well, and the best news about that is if you actually look at an organic model of a spike protein itself, it itself is not lethal. Tiny problem is if I turn it into a bioweapon, which was done in 2016, it is lethal. So the great news is they can answer out of both sides of their mouth.
Right. And we have a number of papers. This is just a small sample that say the spike protein is pathogenic. Spike protein is itself pathogenic. And
it's a scheduled toxin.
Yep. And Dr. Carla Lehman's paper in 2024, let's see here. Yeah. It's a German doctor. So it's reasonably foreseeable for the TGA to know that the spike protein is a toxin, correct?
Exactly, because it's been scheduled as such for over a decade, yes.
Right, thank you. Now, the TGA knowingly and willfully approved, recommended, and forced on people novel injections that convert human cells into making spike protein, correct?
That is correct.
If they did not know about the spike protein effects, why did they approve the COVID shots? If they did know about the spike protein, Why did they approve the COVID shots?
And that's the
And these
beautiful
bastards
thing
are
about
now.
this. Yeah. This is a beautiful thing about it. Remember, the only way, and by the way, they didn't approve them. That's the key thing.
Thank you.
Because approval is a legally defined term. What they did was authorize and then endorse. But approval, the legally defined term prior to 2020, has never been done with these. It's not an approval, it's an authorization. They changed the definition of what it means to approve a thing by the time they got into 2021. But it was never an approved process as the law defines approval.
So in your country, David, it's emergency use approval, I think, something like that.
Authorization.
Authorization. Thank you. And in Australia, it's provisional approval.
That's correct.
Correct, Philip?
That's correct. And that provisional approval pathway was only stood up in 2018. It's
Correct.
a new system, and it was never intended to be used like this. It was intended to be used for experimental rare drugs where patients
Correct.
had very little chance of survival with any other existing type of treatment. And it was very, very rare, and it was worth taking the risk in that patient.
And in the United States, we call it an orphan drug problem.
An orphan drug,
a small, novel chemical entity going after an extremely rare condition. It's exactly
that's exactly right.
Yep.
And what our government did was they took an experimental gene therapy and they advocated its use population-wide for everyone, including children and infants and pregnant women. Right? And they didn't have data.
Who had no epidemiologic risk of dying.
They didn't. The worst part of all this, and I'm just looking at a graph that I found a few days ago, produced by a number of people in Australia who have been submitting freedom of information requests to the TGA because they're very secretive, about the adverse drug reaction reporting system called DAEN in Australia. This would be your equivalent to the VAERS system, but the DAEN covers all drugs in Australia. And it's been very difficult getting data from the TGA on these adverse drug reactions. Now, any drug is a matter of considering the risks and benefits. We now know after 4 years that the COVID vaccines were very disappointing in terms of preventing transmission or infection. And they were dangerous. And the way you assess how dangerous something is in these post-marketing adverse drug reaction reporting systems. Now, in this case, we have the TGA, who's been lying to us constantly for 4 years about the vaccines, saying they were safe. And it's this same organization is solely responsible for reporting and assessing the adverse drug reactions. Let me just tell you a few figures. They were pulled out from adverse drug reactions on the COVID vaccines, retrieved under Freedom of Information, 25-0047, published on the 8th of November last year. So this covers the 1st of December 2020 to the 5th of September 2024. And the Australian government has said that there are 1,037 deaths reported to them in association with the COVID vaccines. Yet they only say there are 14 deaths. They don't even say caused. They say linked to the vaccines. 14 deaths, they say. Yet 1,037 deaths were reported. If you consider the underreporting factor in
Yeah.
all these systems, and especially in the case of COVID, where doctors were basically threatened if they crossed the government narrative
Yeah.
of the safety and efficacy of these vaccines, they could have their license taken away. The underreporting factor is probably more than 100. I don't know if you agree with that, David, but that's my impression.
Yeah.
So of the 1,037 reported deaths, there were really probably 100,000 deaths in Australia. Now, let's look at this freedom of information data. On the day of vaccination, there were 35 deaths. Now, I'll just repeat that. On the day of vaccination, the DAEN system reports 35 deaths. And yet the TGA is reporting overall, over all these years, that there are only 14 deaths associated with the vaccine. I don't believe autopsies were done in these deaths. If you look at the deaths between 1 and 7 days, it's 29%.
Yeah.
Now, when you assess, as David knows, when you assess with Bradford Hill criteria, try and assess whether something is causally linked to a drug. The temporal relationship, the time course, when did you receive the drug and when did you experience the adverse event, is probably the most important thing. Of all the 10 criteria in that list of Bradford Hill criteria, the temporal relationship is probably the most important. And yet there's 35 deaths, I'm looking at them here, on day 0 of the COVID vaccination. It's absolutely astounding. And I'm a different person now. I was a different person in 2019. I was a big pharma guy, worked for a number of big pharma companies, started my own business, very successful, sold that business. And really, I had no idea of the degree of regulatory capture that was ongoing. I had been retired for a number of years, so I was out of things a bit. I consulted and so forth. But seeing what I'm seeing now is something that I would never have dreamt in my lifetime to ever witness. And it is so difficult for me to look back and see how blinded I was. I was in the system and I couldn't see it. I have a lot of colleagues who work for these companies and they can't see it.
Yeah.
So it's no wonder that most people who are out there can't see these things. And there used to be something called, and I used to work in a system called evidence-based medicine, right? And evidence-based medicine was really great, and it had evolved in the 80s to base your therapies and your efficacy assessments and safety assessments on evidence. Evidence-based medicine has a great ring to it. Well, what we're into now, I think, is eminence-based medicine.
Yeah.
Because no matter what sort of submission I make to the authorities, no matter if I attach 50 references, 100 references, and present a cogent case, they just have to write back and say, well, Phil, sorry, you're wrong. We are an august group, and we say the vaccines are safe. And that's evidence-based medicine. And really, it has to stop.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Let's continue with the questions before getting onto the COVID timeline. The simple questions. Deaths during COVID were always, David, within the range of expected annual deaths. COVID never raised the expected deaths above the upper range. So means it's not a pandemic.
Let's just get really clear on the evidence for that. Life insurance claims through the 4 quarters of the pandemic. So by that, I mean January 2020 to December 31st, 2020, life insurance claims dropped. 2020 had record profits for life insurers. The actual number of death claims began to rise with the introduction of the shot. So let's get abundantly clear. We had to stop counting seasonal influenza in March because not influenza went away. And we came up with a whole science on this that I've never heard of in my life, which was viral competition. COVID was so compelling that it wiped out the flu.
Yeah, same here in Australia.
But the data just screams at you. And unless we are willing to accept that COVID, in addition to becoming that vector borne by a bat who read an article in 2016, in addition to that, that bat was also literate to only infect people who were uninsured. That's what you have to accept to believe we have a pandemic. So the bat not only made the 1,000-mile flight, but then along the way contemplated that it only hated people who were uninsured. Those are the 2 conditions that are required for us to believe there actually was a pandemic. So,
if that's a graph, I haven't got a suitable graph here at the moment because it would be too fine. But every year we have an expected range of deaths.
Yep.
And it's between the upper range and the lower range.
Yep.
The lower limit, rather. Every year, that's where the deaths fall. In wintertime, the deaths go up. Summertime, the deaths come down. Wintertime, the deaths go up.
Yeah.
So during COVID, no time did the deaths go above the upper range. So it's nothing unusual.
Until we started injecting people.
That's what I was about to say. Until the moment we introduced the COVID injections, then the deaths shot up above the upper range and pretty much stayed almost entirely above the upper range.
Yeah.
So there's something abnormal going on when the shots were introduced.
That's exactly right.
Okay. In Queensland and Western Australia, we've got perfect test cases, and I heard maybe South Australia, maybe one other country. The injections started in Queensland and Western Australia, and Philip can correct me on this, in 2021, before the COVID virus arrived in those states. Immediately the injections started, the deaths shot off above the upper range. So there's no COVID deaths in that. We know that for a fact. They're entirely COVID injection deaths, and they were severe, very, very high.
Yeah.
Correct, Philip? Can't hear you, Philip.
That is correct. I was muted.
Thank you. The data also shows, David and Philip, that the deaths from the shots and the injuries from the shots are correlated closely with the COVID injections. The concurrence, as I just said, starting with the jabs in 2021, plus the concurrence with the number of injections, especially if you've had 3 or more. The 4th one is horrific. The first booster, the 3rd shot. So why would that be the case? Well, and we've got a huge... Sorry?
Yeah, we need to remember, and a lot of people don't remember this, that a number of things that were classified as even COVID deaths were actually injection deaths. You weren't considered vaccinated. And Philip just read the statistics on the duration between first injection and death. You weren't considered vaccinated until 14 days after the 2nd shot. So let's get really clear.
So if you died in the first 14 days, you were classified as a COVID death.
That's correct. And so we don't have data. We truly don't have any data that actually can be relied upon that could ever link a death to allegedly COVID exposure, because the injection wasn't considered a vaccination until 14 days after the 2nd shot.
And most injuries from a vaccine, from a COVID injection, I don't call them vaccines, they're not vaccines. COVID injection is within a few days after.
For the first 7 days, they knew that when they built the protocol. The first 7 days are when you have these rapid anaphylactic type deaths. Well, the bad news for those is that because you change the definition of a vaccinated person,
Yep.
and a vaccinated person is not vaccinated until they had the second series plus 14 days. So you have this window of time where anybody who got the first shot and died of COVID.
Right. Let's move on to the next one. We've had, since the COVID shots were introduced, a huge increase in varied injuries: heart, cancer, diabetes, brain, reproductive organs. So that begs the question, why? And we'll come on to that in a minute before we get on to the COVID timeline. The COVID spike protein, David, is man-made. It's engineered.
Correct.
Right. Is it different in the virus that was released from the University of North Carolina originally compared with the virus, compared with the spike protein?
Yeah, so that's when
in the injection.
Yeah, we have to get really technically precise about this because, unfortunately, the injection provenance in terms of what the mRNA sequence is unfortunately underreported. What the manufacturers report are essentially ranges of what they're willing to consider the thing that you get injected with. Equally, what we know is that the fragments that are allegedly found under the PCR test are fragments that live inside of ranges. But what we have to understand is that when a foreign entity in the form of the mRNA is introduced to the body, every single human being, and this is really important for us to understand, by virtue of the nature of your own genetics biology, your own biology, your interaction with a protein is not going to be identical to anyone else's interaction. There is not a single thing. It's the reason why some people can eat peanuts and some people can't. Some people eat shellfish and some people can't. The way your body responds to a protein, a foreign instrument of any kind, is unique to you. So the other piece of this, and this is equally important, is that which is produced by your body is also going to be unique to your body. So when I get an injection of mRNA into my cell, and then somebody else gets the same injection into their cell, and by the way, every genetics lab can show this, some interaction between your code and the introduced code happens. That interaction is unique to the individual.
Thank you. So the spike protein in the virus is technically the same, started off the same as the spike protein in the injection, but your body changes it.
Well, and unfortunately, the thing that is called the COVID virus, as I pointed out early on, the protein sequences for both the ACE2 receptor binding domain as well as the spike protein, those were already patented going back to the 2010 to 2016.
Okay. Then we've got a number of other things in the shots, which we can come on to later on. Number of seriously defective things, carcinogenic things. The traditional vaccines have supposedly introduced dead or mild variations of the pathogen, so the immune system can identify and be ready for when the virus later infects the body, correct? Roughly, that's the theory.
That is the classic definition of the vaccine theory. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
But the COVID injections didn't do this. Instead, they turned human cells into spike protein factories and overwhelmed the body's immune system, so it's a killer.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Now, I controversially said you turn a person under the Biological Weapons Convention, you turn a person's body into a bioweapons factory. And that is a legally true statement based on the law.
In addition, the spike protein through the receptors disables or dysregulates the renin-angiotensin system, which is one of the key parts of the immune system. As you point out, it varies from person to person, but that explains a huge variety of injuries. Was the disabling of the renin-angiotensin system, which is documented in some of these papers, due to ignorance, haste, groupthink, deliberate and calculated?
Well, you only engineer a thing to target a specific receptor if it's deliberate and calculated. You can't accidentally do that when you have the data for over a decade saying that that's what it's going to do.
Thank you. So what we need, David, is a royal commission, but we also need treatment and care.
That's
which
correct.
means the bureaucrats that control that right now, suppressing that right now, need to come clean. But we also need compensation. So we need a royal commission, stop the shots immediately. We need treatment, we need care, and we need compensation for people. So now, Dr. Martin, can you tell us the COVID timeline history? Because I was stunned when you made a podcast with Jimmy Dore, I think. I've never seen a comedian so serious in my life. What a wonderful man. But anyway, and you said, wait for it, the COVID timeline started in 1965.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that we could argue it started in 1953 simply because Cold Spring Harbor Lab, which for people who are not paying attention, is the residence of the U.S. Eugenics Office. So just to be clear, the United States Department of Eugenics, which was set up by the Carnegie family in 1913.
Was that a government department?
Yeah, at Cold Spring Harbor
Department
Lab.
of Eugenics.
Still is, not was. What are you talking about? It still is. And it is Cold Spring Harbor Lab who gave us the 1953 definition of DNA, from which we derived the definition of RNA. So the good news is that came out of a eugenics office. So feel really good about that. And you heard the sentence that I just said, a eugenics office. Just let that chill for just a second. So what happens is if we go from 1953 to 1965, what we were looking for was a reproducible pathogen model that we could start playing with. And the coronavirus, because of its non-mutagen or its non-toxicity, but high levels of mutagenicity, was chosen in 1965 and described first in 1965, associated with diarrhea and gastroenteritis in dogs and pigs primarily. But it was associated at times with symptoms that we would refer to as the common cold. So in 1966, a group of US and UK researchers, and I hate to break it to you, but many of them with affiliations, are you ready for this? To the Wellcome Drug Company. So let's get it going. A group of researchers decided to see if they could do a cross-Atlantic collaboration where sputum and mucosal secretions from Americans that were suffering allegedly from common colds could be infected into, and I quote, healthy volunteers in the UK. So the first COVID experiment was 1966. What we found out was we could actually transmit all kinds of nastiness in this. And so from 1966 until the 1970s, there was a bunch of people that were playing around with the coronavirus model as a potential tool for bioengineering, meaning that you would use the outer protein ring, the outer shell of the coronavirus, as a way of introducing agents into the body. In 1990, and you heard the date correct, in 1990, Pfizer filed the first patent on a spike protein coronavirus vaccine. 1990. I love the look on your face. It reminds me of the look on Jimmy Dore's face. You hear about Operation Warp Speed. I don't know what kind of warp speed we're doing when we start in 1990. What they found was what they experimented with was both ineffective. They couldn't get it to work because, unfortunately, the viral model is so mutagenetic, meaning it can change so quickly that if you try to get an injection for one form of it, it jumps into another form and you can't get ahead of it. So for the vast majority of the 90s, the whole experiment got sidetracked until Ralph Baric in 1999 figured out a way to genetically modify chimera of the coronavirus model. So, and I hate to tell this to people because they just hate the concept of it, but this guy who took a common cold and gastroenteritis model figured out how to get it to target heart tissue, to engineer it to hurt something that it didn't before ever even touch. And he modified it so he could create what was called cardiomyopathy in rabbits. Now, what cardiomyopathy is the inflammation and then ultimately hypertrophic change of the heart, which leads to death. And when Anthony Fauci found out about that particular research that he had funded, that Ralph Baric had succeeded in moving the targeting of this thing so he could target specific human tissue, he funded a 3-year program which gave rise in 2002 to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill's first patent on the coronavirus as an infectious replication defective clone. And this
what year was that, David?
2002.
Thank you.
The research grant started in 99. It actually resulted in the patent filing in 2002. That, for the sake of everybody who's listening to this, preceded by 1 year the first outbreak of SARS 1.0. We didn't have any SARS before UNC Chapel Hill Ralph Baric had patented this replication defective clone. So let's get perfectly clear. The universe did not have SARS, ever. Humans made a biological weapon, classified as such in 2005, and we got SARS. So this was not a bat, this was not a pangolin, this was not a bat cave, it was not bat guano, it's none of those things. But the bummer was, for them, that the world didn't fall for the sucker punch of 2003. Because not that many people got sick. This is like the bird flu outbreaks that we constantly are threatened with, where everybody's going to get bird flu. The bummer is not many people get it. Well, actually, nobody gets it. That's the bummer. And
so the replication was defective.
Yeah. And it was engineered to be that. That's the reason why it's so easy to see what it is. If this was really a naturally occurring zoonotic transfer, we'd have all kinds of people dropping like flies. But they don't, because it's not. It is derived from a genetically modified organism, and it's specific to infection but not replication capacity. So by 2005, and this is very important, at 2005, at the DARPA MITRE conference, Ralph Baric announced that his biohacking synthetic coronavirus was, and I'm quoting from him, a biowarfare enabling technology. And it was in 2005 that the United States National Institutes of Health and the United States DARPA, the Defense Advanced Purpose Research Association, those two organizations merged a funding mechanism for biowarfare enabling technologies, which became all kinds of acronyms, PREDICT, and then a bunch of other acronyms that went around with a P3 program, which was Pandemic Preparedness Program. That initiative, beginning in 2005, funded the creation of a number of chimeras of what was then the coronavirus model, and notably gave us all kinds of versions of this that were coming and going and coming and going. But the unholy alliance that happened in 2003 was actually indicative of where this particular program was going, because in April of 2003, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta filed a patent called Coronavirus Isolated from Humans. The Patent Office of the United States rejected the patent as unpatentable because the sequence that they had patented was already published in the public domain, rendering it unpatentable. The CDC had to bribe the Patent Office to issue that patent so that they could control the biologic side of this thing. And here's the irony of that particular story. One day, and you can't make this up, one day after the CDC filed the patent on coronavirus isolated from humans, a company that had never existed, never produced anything, and ironically was not a company associated with any cardiovascular or respiratory diseases at all, Sequoia Pharmaceuticals, filed a patent for the vaccine for coronavirus the day after CDC allegedly isolated the virus. Now, I don't know about you, and you need somebody like Dr. Philip Altman to explain how somebody could invent a virus on one day and within 24 hours. You know how long it takes, by the way, to write a patent? I mean, patents take weeks, months to write. But no, in this case, CDC filed a paper patent at the Paper Patent Office, which could not have been seen, known about. It's not a digital system in 2003. It's a paper system. Somehow mysteriously, 24 hours after the alleged virus was allegedly invented and allegedly first disclosed, the exact same patent office got a delivery of a patent application for the vaccine for the thing that had been discovered 24 hours earlier with data in it. With data. So this Sequoia Pharmaceuticals somehow mysteriously in Bethesda, Maryland, went into a time warp where in the space of 24 hours, they took an invention from Atlanta. They actually did apparently tons of research and came up with a vaccine for a thing that had been invented less than 24 hours ago, and then filed that patent, separated by less than 24 hours. Now, if you actually don't think that you've got a scandal on your hands, there's the smoking gun. You cannot do that. That doesn't exist. And that method was then attempted with MERS. And then a nasty thing happened in 2014. In 2014, the United States decided to put a moratorium on gain-of-function research. And they did it because they were afraid the gain-of-function research was going to ultimately harm and destroy the population because it might escape from labs, it might have lab leak problems, it might unleash a Pandora's box.
And just to butt in there, David, gain of function means that they're doing research, manipulating, varying the virus so that it is either more lethal or more transmissible.
Exactly. So
you get more functionality.
A supercharged feature of whatever the pathogen is. Now, what happened in October of 2014, after the gain of function moratorium was announced by the National Academy of Sciences and all of the federal agencies, NIAID, Anthony Fauci's organization, sent a letter to Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, not only telling him that though this research was gain of function research and subject to the moratorium possibly, he should amend his filing so that he went to an in vivo test of his bioweapon. Now, in vivo, just to be abundantly clear for people who are not familiar with all these science terms, means putting it into living systems. So not only did he greenlight the continued gain of function research, and it says on the last paragraph of the page in the letter, it says, though the gain of function moratorium is in place, because your project is already funded, you are allowed to continue working on it. Does that sound like a moratorium to you? I don't know if it mistranslates when it comes into Australian, but a moratorium to me means stop. And a moratorium in this case meant keep going. Not only keep going, but keep going and put it in. And specifically try to see if you can make it more lethal to, are you ready for this? Lung epithelial cells. Make sure you're targeting the human lung. Here comes the kicker. In 2016, when we have the paper published that WIV1 is poised for human emergence, at the end of the paper, in 3 paragraphs, at the end of the paper, think of it as the acknowledgement section of a book, right at the end, there are 3 paragraphs that specifically say that the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill impaneled an institutional ethics board to review the protocol, to authorize the use of the protocol. But here comes the worst part of it. It also says that they knew there was a gain of function moratorium, so they reviewed the ethics of violating the gain of function moratorium. Yep. This is in their paper. And then they go down and thank the Wuhan Institute of Virology for supplying the viral model that they used to weaponize the gain of function research. So let's be abundantly clear. This campaign of terror was announced as a bomb that, think of Mission Impossible movies or whatever else. When the bad guy switches the switch on and you start seeing the countdown clock going? Well, the bomb switch was thrown in February of 2016 for the Wuhan Institute of Virology virus. So let's get abundantly clear. There was no pandemic in 2019. It was Obama administration throwing the switch on the bomb, and they knew it. In 2018, they wanted to get on the front wave of the flu season that was happening in 2018. Flu season of 2018, if you go back and look at the research, Philip can confirm this, but worldwide, something happened in 2018 which spiked the flu season. Now, I have argued, and by the way, not seen a single scientist willing to take the chance. I have argued that I think that this flu season of 2018 actually wasn't a flu season. I think the flu season of 2018 probably was early dissemination of various forms of this nonsense. But because we didn't do PCR tests and we didn't line people up and we didn't do all kinds of other things, we wanted to see what the lethality was. That's Dave Martin's opinion. I have zero reason other than 2018's flu season is insanely bizarre. But ironically, at the exact same time that 2018's flu season gets bizarre, you have Anthony Fauci going, yep, we're going to have a pandemic. Yep, we're going to have a pandemic. And then you have Gates come out. Yep, we're going to have a pandemic. We're going to have a pandemic. They're announcing that we're going to have a pandemic in the year that we actually showed that we could kill people. And I find that to be circumstantially interesting. I'll leave it at that. I won't say that I'm pointing a finger. I'm simply going, if I was doing a royal commission, I'd want to know what on earth drove a worldwide spike of allegedly flu season in 2018, because it broke the records and it fell far out of the normal curve of influenza. But here comes the kicker. We know that in 2019, well, actually somewhere between December 2018 and January 2019, mysteriously, the National Institute of Health forced or cajoled or got somehow the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill to transfer the patent that Ralph Baric applied for in 2002, to transfer the patent back to NIH. Now, the reason why that's so significant...
Fauci's organization.
Yep. The reason why that's so significant is because under what's called the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, the federal government already has what's called march-in rights, which means if there's a need to use patented technology during an emergency, and the research was done using federal funds, the government already has the right. So transferring the patent would have made no sense at all. There's no reason to do it. But they did it. And then a nasty thing happened in April of 2019. In April of 2019, Moderna mysteriously filed a patent on patents that had been 4 times rejected. Filed a patent, and in the patent on a vaccine platform they were developing, they actually made reference to a, quote, accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen. This was April of 2019. Now, why would you actually amend a failed patent application suddenly in April? Why would you amend it to include an accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen? And why would it be then in September, on September 18th, 2019, that the World Health Organization would announce on page 8 of the text World at Risk, on page 8, why would they announce that they're going to have now an accidental or intentional deliberate release of a lethal respiratory pathogen? Oh, that's right. Because Moderna had already put that process in motion, which then comes very interestingly to a tiny little observation. On November 2019, so this is still a month before anything happened in China. In November of 2019, but if you go back and you look at the historical data on this, it traces all the way back to April. The Vaccine Research Center at the National Institutes of Infectious Disease, so this is Anthony Fauci's organization, was negotiating with UNC Chapel Hill to do what was called a material transfer agreement to get the sequence of the thing that would go into vaccine production. Now, how could you produce a vaccine for a thing that didn't even exist? If you look at the official narrative, didn't even exist until the February 2020 definition of a novel pathogen. Every person who said, every person in the media, every person in politics, might I make reference to Minister Hunt just to make sure I get the sharp point on this thing. Every person who said that there was a novel pathogen lied.
Yep.
Absolutely lied. Every single time that word was used, it was a lie. And there was not a disease caused by a novel pathogen. That's a lie. And that's unambiguously a lie. There was nothing novel about it. By the time it was determined to be novel in February of 2020, there were over 128 published patents on all of the components of what they defined was novel. You can't get a patent from 2016 and then define it as novel in 2020. That is violating every principle of 35 U.S. code. So here's a little tiny problem. We did not have a pandemic. There never was. What we did have was exactly what they said they would do in 2014, a media hype event so that the public would demand a medical countermeasure. And here's the problem. The public didn't demand it. When the public didn't call for it, the government decided it had to mandate it. So their plan almost worked. But the problem for them is that, and this is the giant smoking gun, these things were begun manufacturing before the EUA, which means that they are not, under the legal definition of a protected countermeasure, they are not legally a countermeasure. Because they were all built before the declaration of emergency. So here comes the kicker. The kicker is that we know that the ingredients, the lipid nanoparticles from arbutus and acuitas, which come out of the University of in Alberta, we know that those chemicals were the subject of patent fights between Pfizer, Moderna, and arbutus and acuitas pharmaceuticals because they needed to get the lipid nanoparticle to be used, and they were fighting over it between 2018 and 2020. We know that there was also a massive near bankruptcy of the lipid nanoparticle technology coming out of Canada. So the enabling carrier, the lipid nanoparticle that is known to be toxic to humans, and it's known to create inflammation, it's known to damage epithelial cells, it's known to damage myocytes. We know that. We know it's also a pro-cancer initiator. That technology, which came out of arbutus and acuitas pharmaceuticals fights, was in fact something that was the subject of patent disputes in 2018, 2019, and 2020. So the whole platform, the how you deliver it, the what it is that is being delivered, was known to be toxic, known to be lethal, and every ingredient was known to kill humans by 2018. Every ingredient.
Every ingredient.
So this cocktail that was injected in people's arms in published scientific data was known to be lethal, not injurious. It was known to be lethal.
And
so you could not mix this up without knowing you were mixing up a death agent to kill people.
As somebody said, every component of a medication is there by design. Every one of them. That's not to mention the contamination and the lack of good manufacturing process.
Set aside all that. I'm just saying, by 2018, we knew in published science every component was lethal.
What about the story of Peter Daszak and EcoHealth Alliance? Where do they fit in, David?
That's a giant smokescreen to try to pin this on China. Peter Daszak, and not surprisingly, is a great propaganda initiative, because what happens is that his involvement starting around 2014 was actually a very elaborate cover-up so that we would get tripped up in this whole conversation. Did it come from nature? Did it come from a lab? We're missing reading. I know this is the difficult thing. It's a giant scientific hurdle for most people. Reading the document that said that the Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1 was poised for human emergence in 2016 publication, where the paper was submitted in 2015 on the gain of function research in 2014. Newsflash, it wasn't Peter Daszak. It wasn't EcoHealth Alliance. They were a stooge with $53 million set up as part of the marketing campaign to get the whole world distracted on a China story. You know what nobody bothered with? Is the $500 million that went through the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill's consortium, which actually made the weapon.
Right. So what they've done is they've created, initially it was the wet markets.
Yeah.
Then they've said, oh, look, we've got to admit, we did continue the gain of function research at Wuhan. Yes, the United States paid for it in violation of the law against gain of function research. Yeah, it was Wuhan. But the real story was at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so you had a cover-up of a cover-up, all to get people off the trail.
Well, and the whole thing worked. Look how compelling it was. It worked. To this day, you still have congressional inquiries into the Chinese virus. Yeah. And listen, I mean, as we talked about before, we've talked about the whole, RFK thing. But if you go back and look at the real Anthony Fauci book that RFK, had written, and you look at the contents of that book, and you look at the vast majority of even what people call the medical freedom movement research, somehow or another, UNC Chapel Hill has Teflon.
Yeah,
nobody bothers to look at the publication of evidence. That's why when I get criticized, including my recent criticism by my brother, you shouldn't be so, difficult with respect to what you say about Anthony Fauci. I'm like, well, why not? Because I'm looking at published science. And if you're telling me I shouldn't read the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, then I'm sorry. That feels to me like pretty sciencey science. But
yes.
The fact of the matter is, we have been willing as a world to contemplate the possibility that a weapon, by the way, defined as a weapon in 2005. So this is not Dave's allegation. It was called biowarfare enabling technologies. I don't know if people in Australia are familiar with biowarfare enabling. Does not sound like therapeutic goods administration. Doesn't sound like Food and Drug Administration. You wouldn't use the term biowarfare enabling unless you were talking about, are you ready for this? Biological warfare. Yep. This is one of those things where the information is so compelling and precise. And we live in a world where we're so compelled to disbelieve that anybody could be that evil.
Yeah.
We then create complexities to try to find other explanations. When the criminal holding the bag of money on the bank steps with the gun in his hand, with the mask on his face, with bags full of money, we're going to that robber and saying, could you explain the theory of banks losing money? And we're watching the bank robber sit there going, it's not a theory. I have the bags of money and a gun and a face mask. We're going to that person and going, well, we're really trying to understand why the bank has less money. That's how stupid this is. It truly is stupid. Because the fact of the matter is we're falling for the cover story. And even the people who are allegedly awoken to the medical freedom movement or whatever you want to call it are still perpetrating the single story that keeps us blind to the whole problem. And this is the big problem, that there are 68 other registered scheduled toxins currently under gain-of-function research in the United States, also poised for human emergence. 68 others. So we don't get this one right. Guess what?
Yep, that's right. That's why we're doing this. And I learned
Malcolm, right now, as we sit here, Australia is conducting gain-of-function research.
That's correct.
In Geelong,
that's
and
correct.
Under even NH and MRC grants. There's 17 projects that I can count, but David might know of more.
Yep.
It is incredible. And on top of that, if you look at the highest safety level labs, that's the BSL-4 labs, I don't think there's one BSL-4 lab in the world that hasn't leaked.
Yep.
They all, at one time or another, leak. So if you're making these pathogens that are deadly, that are potentially bioweapons, eventually they're going to leak. And eventually there'll be a disaster. You have to ask yourself, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
So that raises two questions. First of all, a quick answer on Australia's CSIRO proudly admitted in early days of this COVID virus that they were working on a COVID virus in gain-of-function research. They did that. The Australian government's entity, CSIRO, admitted that. But David, going to the more important thing, or perhaps the more significant thing, it was that you gave your first briefing of this to law enforcement intelligence in 2002.
Yep.
What happened?
I was told that it wasn't interesting. And then when I came back from Iran after the bioengineering conference in Iran, and I talked about edible vaccines that were being put in tomato plants so that you could eat your vaccine in a salad. You heard me correctly. So that you could eat a vaccine in a salad because tomato plants could be a vector for putting, quote, vaccines into food. Can you imagine what I'm just saying? You go to a salad bar, you go to a restaurant, you're served tomatoes. You know what you don't know?
Whether it's got anything in it.
And who would think? And when I came back and talked about that, I was told that that wasn't interesting. But I was at a BSL-3 lab in India when I actually saw that production happen. And I've got some bad news for both of you. I looked up in the roof of that building. There was a broken window and birds were flying in and out of the lab. I don't know about you, but I don't know.
That's
Is it
terrifying.
possible that a bird could potentially eat a seed? I mean, that would obviously be a very novel scientific concept, that a bird might eat a seed, because that's what birds eat. Birds were flying in and out of a BSL-3. That was a BSL-3 lab. And we weren't supposed to be concerned about that.
So let's turn.
I've been in BSL-3 and BSL-4 labs all over the world. And I will tell you that my bird story in India is one of hundreds of stories I can tell you about this level of compromise. The fact of the matter is, human beings using taxpayer dollars in every one of these countries, largely coordinated, I hate to say this, but it is largely coordinated by the United States. So blame where blame belongs. We are authorizing and developing things that we know have lethality. We want to increase their lethality, and we want to make sure that we allegedly control it so that, quote, bad guys might one day not use it. Well, yes, guess what?
Okay.
The bad guy sometime is the man in the mirror.
Can we go to Event 201? Can you tell us what that was? What took place there? What were the aims of that Event 201?
Yes, so this was a nasty little cover-up too, because Event 201 in October of 2019 was a war game scenario of what, in fact, 3 months later became the propaganda machine to see if the public would buy into the story of the terror campaign. The problem with that, when it was funded, although it actually says the sponsors, and this is very tricky, the sponsors allegedly were the Johns Hopkins University, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the World Economic Forum. Those were the masthead sponsors. But it turns out that the check for that was written by a company called Open Philanthropy. Open Philanthropy, I know this is going to come as a huge shock, is actually funded by none other than Dustin Moskowitz. And Dustin Moskowitz is the co. And it turns out that the entire apparatus of information and message control, as we now see, now that there's been the revelations of what happened when the Biden administration was working on making sure all of the censorship that became national policy in 2021, the fact of the matter is all of those programs were actually preordained by the guy, ready for this, who funded the platform that was the first and most egregious to censor and shut down all communications. And it turns out that the guy who funded the Event 201 simulation, and by the way, who has funded a bunch of the other simulations, happens to be the founder of Facebook.
Zuckerberg.
No, Dustin Moskowitz, the name you don't know. And you don't know because that is the name that's kept out of every publication. Nobody even, what I just said, seriously, everybody who thinks that that Event 201 was sponsored by Gates and by Johns Hopkins and World Economic Forum never bothers to read the check writer's name. This was a social engineering media event to get the world prepared to respond to their biggest problem, because their biggest problem was going to be people like me who would actually have a voice outside of the mainstream media, and they needed to figure out how to shut that down. They spent an enormous amount of the event focusing on how to deal with what they called, quote, disinformation. Well, what's disinformation? It's actually information that doesn't go with the narrative.
Yep. So we saw a strange list of characteristics that indicate it's not a natural mutation of a respiratory disease. Circulating in northern summer. This is according to Brett Weinstein and Jessica Rose. Circulating in northern summer, not winter, summer. Loss of smell, anosmia, at times permanent. Unusual symptoms. Women's menstrual cycles disrupted. Some stop bleeding, others heavy bleeding. postmenopausal women restarted bleeding, doctors seeing unusual patterns in patients, not transmissible outdoors. So did that signify that the lab developed and selected based on its lab behaviors? Doctors that treated with ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine had immediate success. And as I said, doctors Jessica Rose and Brett Weinstein agree that these are symptoms of an RNA virus, including SARS-CoV-2, not a DNA virus. Is that pretty well accurate?
That is absolutely right. And we know, and that's why I said, I think if we go back, and by the way, it'd be simple to do. You could take path reports from tissue samples and tissue banks, go back to 2018 and see if it's there. And I'd be willing to suspect that some of the RNA fragments are present in tissue pathology reports from 2018. Conspicuously, nobody's doing that, despite the fact there are tissue banks all over the world that would have plenty of samples.
The CDC accidentally shipped contaminated tests. Is that correct?
Not only accidentally shipped, somehow mysteriously were able to get allegedly pathogens on test swabs. And under the definition of good clinical practice, which is a standard of medical manufacturing, that can't even be possible. You can't have a contaminated swab by definition, because the swab has to be manufactured in an environment where the pathogen isn't. So to have a contaminated swab means somebody put it there in violation of the FDA's standards for good clinical manufacturing process.
So
it's
the funding
GCMP.
Funding campaign combination of Department of Defense, NIH, any other departments involved?
Well, oddly enough, yes, the Department of Energy, which you would highly suspect, unless you're, crazy conspiracy theorist, and you go back and look at the actual funding. Department of Energy, National Institutes of Health, Department of Health and Human Services, and the Defense Department are the 4 top funding agencies.
So there's no way this could have been accidental, haphazard, or mistaken.
No, it's published, premeditated. Every bit of it is.
And defense countermeasures, Sasha Latipova blew the whistle on that, a contract research operator in organization in America. And 2005 was funding for the civilian deployment of a biological weapon.
And that's part of the DARPA MITRE program that I referred to, where Ralph Baric was invited to announce that coronavirus was biowarfare enabling technology.
You've already gone over many of my questions. Is there someone called Sherry Settle in an October 2014 letter authorization for global distribution in 2016?
So Sherry Settle is associated with a number of letters that actually talk about the dissemination of biologic agents.
Okay. I'll just go through some of the questions. Well,
yeah, and I need to wrap up here pretty soon. So
you've covered most of the things.
I think the critical message that I would love to see is the recognition that one of the greatest hurdles we have to work with, and I say this metaphorically and literally, that I've never met a fact that overwhelms a belief.
Yeah.
But I want to be really clear on what I mean by that.
Yeah.
At some point, we have to, as a society, recognize that our public agencies, and for that matter, most of our kind of geopolitical efforts, are captive agencies. We want to live in this illusion that somehow or another the elections that we do and the people we elect are somehow above the capacity of falling for what a captured interest. If we understand that in the United States, as an example, the pharmaceutical industrial complex has 4 times more lobbying power than any other industry. That's more than big oil. That's more than carbon, anything. That's more than defense. That's more than IT. 4 times more money is spent to influence the public policy by pharma than any other industry at all. And listen to what I'm saying, 4 times more. So think of the biggest tech companies. Think of the biggest defense companies. Think of the big telecom companies. Think of all of the other energy sector, right? 4 times more is spent by pharma than anything else. I've said this and people don't like to hear it. But when I was in Australia, the number of people said, well, at least we have free healthcare. You do not have free healthcare in Australia. That is an oxymoron. It's a mind control exercise to get you to believe that somehow this is a social welfare program that's good for you. But the problem is, as Dr. Altman just pointed out, and Senator Roberts, you pointed out at the beginning, if TGA is a captured agency, the handmaiden of pharmaceutical companies, then what you have is you have a social distribution of drug dealers.
Yep.
And they're masquerading under this title called public health. We need to understand this, because if we are going to reclaim individual health and sovereignty as just people, we have to get out of our illusion that somehow or another there's a patriarchal system that has somehow got our vested interest in mind. When you have an organization of any government, whether it's a state level, federal level government, that decides to mandate things that they know are lethal into their population, that's not health. And it's no surprise that if we go back to 1953, we see where it came from. The eugenics office. This was not coming from the human optimization office. This was coming from a eugenics office. People must get to the point of examining not the COVID scandal itself, which is obviously filled with merit, and there's all kinds of bad guys to find. But the bigger problem is that we have an institution level corruption. And the institution level corruption is not getting the examination it needs. And until that happens, we will simply swap one biological weapon for the next. And there are 63 loaded weapons in the chamber.
What about, can you talk about the suppression of a proven, safe, effective, accessible treatments, ivermectin, zinc, and vitamin D, and hydroxychloroquine?
Very, very worthwhile to point out, because if you look at Ralph Barick's work in 2010, moving through 2014, he knew he was working with a loaded weapon. And so he's the one that published what became the Zelenko Protocol. He published the countermeasure to the weapon that he developed. Zev Zelenko, the guy who came up with the zinc and zinc ionophore combinations, very famously now part of the wellness company programs that they also are circulating, and a lot of other people around the world, including a bunch of Indian researchers. They read Ralph Barick's countermeasure. He made this combination so that if he and his colleagues got sick, they had a treatment. They knew it was effective because they made it so that if they had something blow up in their lab, they could treat themselves.
And they also needed to suppress ivermectin because it was successful, and zinc and vitamin D, because otherwise people wouldn't fall for taking experimental gene therapy-based treatment. Yeah,
well, you can't have an emergency countermeasure if there is an established treatment. So you have to outlaw the treatment so that you can force a countermeasure, because if there is an established treatment, then the medical countermeasure can't be mandated. That's the law. So they have to shut down the proven. And in this case, the irony is the bomb maker made the countermeasure.
Yes. And so what really emerges from this is not just deep questions and concerns. The shots were designed to kill people.
That's exactly correct. And they knew it, and they knew it by 2018.
And, initially, David, because we're responsible ultimately for people's lives, when we saw the pictures and the videos from China and Italy and people lying in the morgues in Manhattan and all the rest of it, we didn't realize they were fabricated. So we had to give the government an open check and say, go to it, you're the government, go to it. Then I wrote to the Prime Minister and the Premier of our state at the time, Anastasia Palaszczuk, and said, give me the evidence. And they gave me crap in response. I wrote again a few months later, and they gave me crap again. And so what we really need to understand is that they were all captured, whether by fear or by deliberate fraud, whatever. They were captured. So what we've got is a major failure in the public health system in this country,
Yeah.
major failure in governance in this country. And then we saw the next aspect, which was the smashing of true informed consent and COVID mandates. And
well, remember that informed consent, Malcolm, can only happen when both parties are fully informed of all the facts.
Correct.
I have said numerous times, to this day, there is no chance that any human being, if they were presented with the fact of pseudouridine, which is a published cancer-causing agent, and lipid nanoparticles, which is a proven both cancer and heart disease-causing agent. If simple informed consent, this injection may make you have turbo cancer or may cause your heart to inflame to the point of death, or it might protect you from the less than 1% chance you might get a sniffle. There's not a human being on the planet who will take that risk benefit and say, oh, yeah, give me the shot. And these are published numbers, which means to this day, no informed consent has ever been given and none has been received. Because if that were the case, no one would take it. But that's the point. The point is the public mandate to force people into this injection at pain of losing their jobs, losing their ability to travel, losing their ability to associate. This was coercion. This was not consent.
Well, when we first started waking up, a few months after the COVID declaration in Australia, I thought some of this has been premeditated, but I was talking about months.
Yeah.
And then I thought, hang on, this has been a couple of years in the process. Then I realized that our government had joined with the American, Canadian, and British government to sign a defense countermeasures consortium arrangement involving the defense back in 2008. I think we joined them. You guys signed it in 2007. Yeah. Then I started to realize the development of this was years in the making, decades in the making. Yeah. And so then I think you've opened my eyes going back to 1953, was it?
Yep.
So that now that we know that the origins of it, we can see that in the eugenic society, we can see that there really is sinister motives. Why don't people want to believe that? Is it, as you said in Jimmy Dore, that if you have one murder, you can believe that, 2 murders, a serial killer. But when you start getting above that, people just don't want to admit that some humans, a very small number of humans, can be that way. What's the reason?
Well, listen, I've said many times that the real opportunity for the COVID pandemic is to examine our definition and our perspective of what humanity is. If we are allowing the currency of fear and death to be our motivator, then giant surprise, people who wish to control us are going to use the currency of fear and death to manipulate us. Most people are actually quite content living in a world where they spend most of their time fearing death, fearing disability. And if somebody comes along and preys on that fear, giant surprise, they'll win. What we need to do is look at the fact that we have failed as a society of modeling a life and a way of living that is aligned to a life-based, vitality-based, successful, thriving-based model. We still allow ourselves to be manipulated by fear, and we allow governments, we allow civil society, we allow non-governmental organizations to have this view that says, well, we will be your protector, we will be your savior. Once you've decided to put your savior and your protector role on an institution, you have opened yourself up to the very power and control that they seek, which means that it is time for people to reclaim their accountability and their responsibility and not look to some big government, big NGO, big program somewhere to save them from accountability. I get up every morning and I work out in the gym, and I don't do that because I have a vanity problem. I do that because it's aligned to my well-being. Now, do I like the effects of my workout on my physical body? Absolutely. But I do it because I realize that part of my day is how I exercise, the nutrition that I take in, all of the things that make a human experience vital. And what I'm saying is a call for personal accountability. This is not going to be solved by the same government that created the problem. It cannot be. And so we need to make sure that while we have accountability in the public sector, which I totally endorse, we have to have the private accountability of the individual responsibilities we have to say we have to break down our belief system that somewhere out there is this patriarchal protector that's somehow going to take care of the problem, including, by the way, in this case, the problem they themselves created. The government will not be where this is solved. The people have to solve this. And that means significant reform to institutions that the vast majority of people still want. And what I'm saying is you have to challenge it at the root of the tree. You can't criticize the fruit.
Right. The problem with the democratic country lies in the people not being engaged.
That's correct.
Just tidying up some details. Moderna.
Yeah, I am going to have to wrap here in a little bit. I'm a little over my limit. So.
Okay. Moderna came out of the 10-year National Science Foundation project from 2000 to 2010 called the Darwinian Chemical Systems.
That's correct.
Correct. Okay. Pfizer and Moderna plan to release a future range of drugs for humans and maybe animals on the mRNA platform.
That is correct. And they are currently trying to push very hard to do that. And Moderna already has a patent. Are you ready for this? For a vaccine for opioid addiction. Did you hear what I just said?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, a vaccine for opioid addiction. Just think about how ridiculous that is.
So what you've shown us, David, is that we can now understand why a PSYOP operation was used to build fear to bypass regulatory safety barriers, and almost all testing was bypassed.
That's exactly right. And the good news is they told us they were going to do it.
Motives? What are the motives?
Well, this is where we have to look at the perpetrator's own words. And this is no different from most of the other narratives, the climate change narrative and everything else. There is a worldview that says that Earth has a carrying capacity defined by a scarcity model where we are allegedly over the carrying capacity of the Earth, and we have to somehow downsize and shrink the population. Now, if you believe in a world, this is why I said facts, unfortunately, can't overwhelm beliefs. If you believe in a world that says that there are too many people, despite the fact that I can get in a plane in Sydney and fly to Perth and fly over, I don't know, 86% of the country where there's no evidence of any habitation. Just looking out the window. I can get on a plane in Washington, D.C., and I can fly to L.A., and 38% of the land I cover doesn't even have a road or any configuration on it. But allegedly, the carrying capacity of Earth is over its tipping point. Here's the problem. In a world defined in 1776 as a world of scarcity, where only a few can benefit at the extreme, then the carrying capacity of Earth is way over its limit. If, however, you have a worldview that says humans are amazing, creative, ingenious beings that have the capacity to be met with challenges and rise to those challenges, if you have a worldview that says that the world is as abundant as our perspective on the resources of energy and everything else that is actually on Earth, you don't want to kill people off. So when in 2011, the Gates Foundation and the World Health Organization declared in the decade of the vaccine, which is what their title publication was in 2011, when they declared that vaccination would reduce the world's population between 10 and 15%, they actually said reduce the population.
Yep.
I don't know how you interpret that in Australia. I know how I interpret that in America. That sounds like getting rid of people.
It does to me.
And
just
came out of eugenics. We have to understand that there's a worldview that since 1913, since the United States Eugenics Office was established in 1913, since that time, the worldview that has prevailed is that there are too many people and some of them have to die.
That's one of the motives. Another motive would be money, as usual. Another motive is control.
Well, in the United States, we have a different motive about money, and that is that the reason why we decided to inject over 65 population first, with no epidemiologic data to support that decision, with no demographic data to support that decision, and with no other data to support that decision, it happens to be the age at which Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid benefits get paid. And as we just found out, I've been yelling about this since 2007. It turns out if you can shrink the number of recipients of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, you don't have to pay as many people. And giant shock. I said that in 2007 and 2008 because we knew that Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security pension reserve funds would go to zero by 2027 or 2028. And that's published data from CBO and from the Social Security Administration itself. We knew we were going to run out of money. So the way you deal with running out of money is, oh, that's right, have less people to pay.
Right. And another little detail, Clinton made possible for Big Pharma to advertise and buy off the media through the Telecommunications Act of 1996.
Yep. And if we had any brains about us, we would actually pull every ad that says you might get rid of, your eczema, but you might have, anal leakage, and you might have your eyes fall out, and you might have cancer, and you might die or have suicidal thoughts. Like, if you seriously listen to any U.S. pharmaceutical ad, the fact that anybody takes anything is shocking, because the list of side effects that are listed in every one of those ads is stuff that would peel the paint off of your moral walls if you had a house.
Yeah.
And we say it like it's just, oh, yeah, of course. We're not going to worry about that.
The same people pushing this are involved with the push for global governance?
Well, it is the global governments that actually made the whole thing happen.
Right. That's exactly it. Let me just skip this. Are you aware of any possible treatments for the spike protein, apart from ivermectin, zinc, vitamin D?
What we know is there are a number of things that have been floated. I would say that, like with every form of disease, the best treatment is exploring your humanity and actually moving out of fear and moving into vibrancy. The best thing on earth to do is to make sure that you clean up your diet. And the one thing that people are playing around with, which the data is equivocal. I think there's some good data on it. I think there's some difficult data in it as well. But people have been talking about nattokinase. People have been talking about more vitamin D. People have been talking about a number of things. I happen to recommend that, the best thing to do is step away from fear and move into live as healthy and cleanly as you can, and give the cancer less chance to start, give the heart disease less chance to start. And I'm focusing, as I encourage everybody to, focus on health.
Thank you. Speaking of health, are you afraid of being silenced permanently?
No.
I heard your answer. Sorry, not at all.
Nope.
Why? Why not? Apart from your moral fortitude?
Well, let me say this very clearly. The interests who obviously are very opposed to what I have to say are ironically as powerful as we give them power.
Yes.
Ironically, as you all know, I was outspoken from before the beginning of this thing, which obviously it's not before the beginning, because the beginning goes a long way back. It goes before me. But the fact of the matter is, we only have a fear if we transfer our power to those who wield fear. And this is really important. If we transfer our power to them, then they do have control. But I have said in many circles, I am certain that somewhere in some dimension, there's a use by date somewhere on this thing called Dave Martin. And I'm sure on the use by date, I'll smell like a bad milk jug in a refrigerator, and people go, yep, that's enough of that. But between now and then, what I know is that I, the purveyor of this information, these are not my facts. These are facts. This program, this conversation lives whether I am or not. And the fact of the matter is, I have done, as I've done in the anthrax scare in 2001, I did when I started auditing white-collar crime among the largest corporations on the planet in 2003. I have reserved my position as the purveyor of facts Dave Martin has never sought to be enriched. Dave Martin has never sought to claim authority. Dave Martin has never sought to claim power. All I've done in every one of those instances and said, here's information. And the bummer is, once that's out, then I'm not the threat anymore. The
That's true.
Threat.
I've had people ask me the same question, and I said, I'm not at all afraid because I don't think about it. There's no point in thinking about it. I was raised to tell the truth, and that's the way it is. I also want to acknowledge other people around the world just briefly. Peter McCulloch, Pierre Corey, Angus Dalgleish, the Australian Medical Professional Society, Red Union, Clive Palmer for bringing some of those people to Australia. People not just in Australia, people not just in America, but globally. People are waking to the main tyrants, which is elected governments. The main tyrants that we face now, elected governments, but they're only the foot soldiers for the major corporations, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. And one interesting thing I've noticed is that when COVID arose, it was in the communities that opposed it, it was the women that led the way. It was the women. And I also want to acknowledge those who are hurt, regretful, fooled, because you're victims of the world's greatest propaganda campaign. So try to remove guilt. Solutions, what do we need to prevent inhuman recurrence? Compensation. So we need to keep working with these facts. Treatment, care for those who are affected medically by the COVID injections. Restoring democracy. I was going to ask you what's needed. You've already told us. Same line we've been pushing here. Holding bureaucrats accountable. Doctors and healthcare professionals need to be held accountable. Where can people find more about you, Dr. Martin? Where can they learn more about you? Website, books?
So davidmartin.world is the website that's easy to find. davidmartin.world. My X account is Dr. D Martin World on X, which is where I post everything. Kim and I established, at Kim's insistence and at her initiative, we established a YouTube channel, David Martin World. And on that, we have several hundred videos that have the entirety of all of the references to every one of these documents. And so if you go to David Martin World on YouTube, you can actually access almost all this content. The most watched video that exists is my European Union Parliament speech.
Excellent.
From May of 2023. It happens now to be the most downloaded video apparently in human history. It's got over 4 billion views now. So the good news is people are seeing it. To your point, they're starting to wake up to it. They continue to see it. I had a very funny graph that came out a couple of years ago in one of the publications that my content was more popular than Taylor Swift's release of a new album in 24 hours. So that was pretty funny. Listen, the thing is, what I would say to anybody is really simple. Don't believe a word I said. Don't believe it. Go back and look at the facts. These are facts. It's not a belief. And it's really important that we get really comfortable with, even if somebody speaks with a great deal of authority, and if even somebody speaks with a great deal of conviction, that's wonderful. But it's incumbent on all of us to go back and look and examine the facts. Draw your own conclusions. Inform yourself. Empower yourself. When you see that 2016 article that says WIV1 poised for human emergence, you don't have to believe me. Read the last 3 paragraphs. You don't even have to read all the science. Read the last 3 paragraphs. Look at the fact that they knew they were breaking the law. They knew they were doing this, and they knew they were creating a problem while the gain of function moratorium was going on. These are not Dave Martin's opinions. And I would deeply encourage you in this closing moment to make sure I am subject to every bit of the frailty every human is. Everyone. I am merely a voice pointing in a direction of information that informs and empowers you. But it is incumbent on each and every one of you to take the information, critique it, make your own critical analysis, and come to your own conclusion, because then it becomes your campaign. It becomes your cause. And so as much as I appreciate everybody who's out in front, and Senator Roberts, I'm glad that you acknowledge so many wonderful people, the ones that we have with us, the ones that passed. Dr. Zelenko, for me, was a wonderful
Yeah.
And all I'm saying is, these are all wonderful people doing their very best. But as I'm standing here, honored to be with Dr. Altman and Senator Roberts and all the wonderful people we just mentioned, the fact of the matter is we are just capable of pointing you in the direction of information, which now is incumbent on you to examine, you to critique, you to draw your conclusions, and you to take action.
Can I give you a plug for this book, Coup de 12?
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Look, I've never read a fiction book, supposedly fictional book, where I've made so many notes in it. It's a wonderful book. It's a true story, I think, from put in a novel.
I keep saying it's a novel. I keep telling people it's a novel.
I've only read the first third, but it's a wonderful book. Could I also thank another group of people, David, and that is the people who've listened to the end of this show, especially those who are injected or allowed their children to be injected, or parents or friends to be injected, and to acknowledge Dr. Philip Altman, because he's said that he was wrong about Big Pharma. He was surprised. He's worked 40 years with them. He didn't see what was going on. And it takes a really strong person to admit a mistake. It takes. So thank you very much, Philip. You've earned my respect over the last 5 years abundantly, many, many times over. And thank you for all the help you've given us. But the people who have been conned by this, who advocated that people take the shots, the radio hosts, the TV hosts, you are a victim of the world's largest, most powerful, and most pervasive propaganda campaign that assaulted us from many angles, and it continues today. So don't feel guilty. Please just take David's advice, which is to realize that you're a wonderful person and to live in that and live without fear. The other thing I want to finish with is we need a royal commission to establish how much Big Pharma must pay in compensation. The government is liable because the CSIRO developed the virus in part of their research. But not only that, the taxpayers have to pay for the government if the government pays compensation. So we want Big Pharma to compensate the government, not the taxpayer. And we want the money that we've given to Big Pharma, $18 billion, I think, to be returned to us, because we've now understand the circumstances under which they received that money. We want to treat the millions of people whose lives the COVID injections have crippled, and bust the guilty and the negligent, because we're going to hound these people down, David, and I'd love to continue working with you and Philip, because we're going to hound these mongrels down, because we all shape our future. I believe firmly in that.
Very good.
Any further thing you want to say?
It's an honor to spend time with you, Dr. Altman. It's an honor to finally meet you face to face, and I look forward to the time when Australia can have a border open enough that it can allow the virus of my thoughts to come back in, because I'd love to go back and hang out.
Well, if we can help you, David, if we can help you, let us know. But don't click off, because the recording still has to be uploaded, please.
No worries.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Philip, especially with your sickness.
Thank you.